Welcome to Japan True Stories. Tonight, a quiet story from Japan. Settle in. The hours after dark carry their own kind of knowing. These are stories from lives shaped by seasons and silences older than anyone can remember. Stay a while. Somewhere in a small apartment in Japan, on an evening when the summer warmth had only just begun to soften at the edges, a young man named Sora was sitting in front of his laptop with the calm certainty of someone who believed, sincerely, that he had made a discovery. The world around him, he felt, was moving in a single direction. Everyone was saying that the weak yen made overseas travel too expensive, that London in particular was impossible, that the prices there would drain a person dry before they had even seen anything worth seeing. And Sora, who had always loved nothing so much as moving against the current of things, saw in this a kind of opening. He mentioned to his companion Mia, who lived nearby and had a considerably more level head about most matters, that he had identified what he thought of as a gap in the market. Mia listened with the patience of someone who has heard this kind of thing before, as he laid out his logic that when everyone moves away from a thing, the thoughtful person walks toward it, and that now was precisely the moment to go to London. Pause. She noted, with a gentleness that was perhaps also a kind of early warning, that Britain's inflation rate had been running well above most people's wage increases, and that a single bowl of ramen there now cost the equivalent of 3,000 yen. Sora was, to put it gently, undeterred. He had also, he told her, found a solution to the cost of the journey itself, a routing that went the long way around, with a 19-hour connection in Beijing, the whole return trip priced at around 120,000 yen, a significant saving over a direct flight. Mia observed quietly that the direct route took 14 hours, and that spending an entire day on airport benches to save a few tens of thousands of yen might cost something rather harder to measure. Pause. But Sora had already worked out the trade in his own way. The money saved would go toward a proper afternoon tea, the kind served on tiered stands with small sandwiches and warm scones, which he had seen in photographs and very much intended to experience. And so it was settled, in the way that these things sometimes are, when one person has made up their mind completely and the other has decided, out of some mixture of affection and curiosity, to simply come along. In the days before they left, Sora worked on what he privately thought of as his inflation strategy. He spread his suitcase open on the tatami matting of his apartment floor and began carefully filling the lower half with instant noodle cups and packets of microwavable rice, arranging them with the focused satisfaction of someone solving a puzzle that no one else can see. Breath. His logic was simple and, in its own way, elegant. If he brought enough food from Japan, the cost of eating in London would fall to near nothing. Mia, standing in the doorway with her arms folded, spoke quietly about British customs regulations, about long-standing rules around meat products, about the fact that the instant noodles he was packing contained pork extract, which the border considered a meat product regardless of how it had been processed. Sora held up one of the packets and replied slowly that the pork in question had been dried, powdered, reduced to something so far from its original form that calling it meat seemed, to him, overly literal. Pause. Mia answered gently that the customs officers did not tend to share that view. There was a silence between them, the kind that follows information no one particularly wants to be true. He found one packet of tempura soba noodles, made with seafood broth, and wondered aloud whether that one, at least, might be allowed through. Mia told him it probably would pass, though she added that any packet with a photograph of an animal on the label might attract attention, and that if he could not explain it clearly in English, it was safer to leave it behind. The suitcase grew lighter and lighter as one packet after another was lifted out and set beside the futon, the little stack of instant noodles that had been meant to save him sitting there quietly on the floor. Pause. To all of this, Sora added the discovery that his old hair iron, bought some years ago in Japan, ran on a voltage incompatible with British sockets that, plugging it in a broad would, in Mia's careful phrasing, produce an outcome neither of them wanted. A voltage converter went onto the list. A travel adapter joined it. The savings from the cheaper flight were already, before the journey had even begun, finding other places to go. The journey itself, the long route, the overnight wait in Beijing, the full 35 hours of transit, is the sort of experience that is easier to describe at a distance than to live through in the moment. By the time Sora and Mia finally stepped into the arrivals hall at Heathrow, they were carrying the particular weight of people who have slept in fragments across 3 time zones, who have eaten from vending machines in the middle of the night, who have watched departure boards for so long that the letters stop meaning anything. Mia would recall, much later, that the first thing either of them said upon arriving was simply that they wanted a bath, a real bath, with hot water and no schedule attached to it. Pause. But London, as it turned out, began right there in the airport, the way London tends to begin everywhere. Sora found a vending machine near the baggage carousel, and the smallest bottle of water was priced at £3, which, at the exchange rate of that day with handling fees included, came to something over 600 yen. He stood in front of the machine for a while, the kind of standing that is also a form of quiet argument with the universe. 600 yen was, he found himself thinking, enough to buy 8 large bottles of water on special offer at a supermarket back home. Pause. He decided he would not buy the water. Mia, who had been standing beside him watching, took out her card and paid for it without a word. There is something both funny and tender in that moment, the two of them at the edge of an unfamiliar city, one refusing on principle to spend 600 yen on water, the other simply paying without discussion, because thirst remains thirst regardless of the principle involved. The tube carried them from the airport toward the center of the city in carriages that the warmth of a London summer had filled entirely, because the deeper lines of the underground had never been fitted with air conditioning. The tunnels down there were old, built in an age when the city was still partly lit by gas, and they had retained the heat of 160 summers in their stone and iron, and gave none of it back. Pause. Sora sat in the swaying carriage and watched the darkness through the window and tried to follow the station announcements, which arrived in a version of English just slightly faster than he could fully catch, the words blurring at the edges the way words do when you are very tired and the air is warm. His phone showed no signal. He noticed, after a while, that when he pressed a handkerchief to his nose, it came away darkened with fine particles iron dust from the ancient tracks, Mia told him softly, something so old it had simply become part of the atmosphere down there, breathed in by millions of commuters across more than a century. The train deposited them, eventually, at their stop, and they climbed upward through tiled corridors into the daylight, and London spread out around them in its grey and particular way. Pause. A single ride had cost the equivalent of 500 yen, which Sora counted twice to be sure. He found himself thinking of Tokyo, where you could cross most of the city for considerably less. They found a cafe not far from the station, with bare wooden tables and a glass case full of pastries, and went in because Mia said her feet needed a rest and because the smell of coffee was very persuasive. Breath. The latte, when it arrived, was priced at something close to 950 yen in conversion, which Sora admitted, or at least did not contest aloud, was a price he could perhaps accept. Then Mia turned the receipt over and they both saw the line at the bottom, an optional service charge of 12.5%. Sora observed quietly that 12.5% was higher than Japan's consumption tax. Mia replied gently that it was optional in name only, and that declining it tended to involve a conversation with a manager that neither of them currently had the energy for. Pause. The charge was paid. They sat for a long time after the coffee was finished, Sora with both hands around the empty cup, using the cafe's Wi-Fi and the electrical outlet behind their chair with the quiet determination of people extracting every last thing from a situation that has already cost them. There is something endearing in that, too, the way a tired traveler wrings every bit of warmth and connection from a single cup of coffee before going back out into a city that does not adjust its prices for sentiment. The following morning, the smell of a full English breakfast drifted through the street outside their hotel, sausages and baked beans and eggs on a plate designed for a scale of appetite somewhat larger than Sora's usual morning. Pause. He stood on the pavement and looked at the photograph on the cafe's menu board with genuine longing, the kind that is also a sense of obligation, a feeling that having come all this way, certain things must be attempted. The price was £16.5. He stood very still. £16.5 converted to something above 3,000 yen, roughly what 8 breakfasts at a beloved chain restaurant back home would cost, and he found himself doing that calculation twice, the way you do when you are hoping the second answer will be different. He ordered toast. Pause. Mia ordered toast as well, and they ate it together with the small, private solemnity of people who have made a decision they know they will remember, and who are not entirely sorry about it. The British Museum was free to enter, and this, Sora felt somewhere in his tired chest, was London finally offering something back. Breath. They moved through the galleries for several hours, from the Rosetta Stone to the Egyptian rooms, past cases of ancient things that had outlasted every economy and exchange rate that had ever troubled anyone, and for a while the city's prices receded and there was only the cool of the building and the low sound of many languages spoken softly nearby. Near the exit, Mia found a small rubber duck in the gift shop shaped like an Egyptian pharaoh and picked it up with the kind of delight that does not stop to calculate. Pause. It cost £9. Sora had been looking at a USB drive printed with a Rosetta Stone pattern, priced at £15, and he set it back down on the shelf with the careful movements of someone returning something irreplaceable. Mia bought the duck, because, she told him softly, museum shops sell memories, and the cost of a memory is whatever you decide it is worth. He considered this for a moment, and then nodded, and did not argue. At Borough Market, the old food market near the river, the smells of 100 kitchens gathered together under canvas and ironed paella in enormous pans, strawberries dipped in chocolate and arranged in paper cups, bread still warm from ovens, seafood laid out on ice in configurations designed to be admired as much as eaten. Sora moved through the stalls with the expression of someone who is simultaneously very hungry and doing arithmetic, which is not a comfortable combination. Pause. The chocolate-covered strawberries, which Mia paused at with interest, were £8.50 for a cup, closer to 1,800 yen, and had become expensive partly because they had become famous on social media, which had not helped matters. Paella was £15 a plate. A mixed seafood roll was 28. They found a bakery stall where a large pastry cost around 1,000 yen, and they bought one and shared it between them, standing in the middle of the crowded market with the good cheer of people who have made their peace with a situation. Later, at a large pub chain that Mia knew was the most affordable place in the city for a proper meal, Sora ate fish and chips, the batter thick, the fish honest, the plate piled with chips in a way that suggested someone had decided abundance was the right approach. Pause. The meal cost the equivalent of 2,400 yen, which was less than anywhere else they had looked, and Sora ate every chip with the steady attention of someone who has committed to getting full value, one piece at a time. Mia noted that a pint of beer there cost £4, 800 yen, and added, with something close to wonder in her voice, that this was widely considered to be cheap. The city, Sora was slowly coming to understand, had its own sense of proportion, its own idea of what things were worth, and it had arrived at those ideas entirely without consulting him. But the fish was real, and the chips were plentiful, and outside the pub's old windows, London was carrying on through its evening in the unhurried way that very old cities tend to carry on. Pause. By the time they made their way back toward the hotel, the day had accumulated in both of them, the long walks, the small shocks at each receipt, the heat of the underground, the crowds, the constant gentle effort of being somewhere unfamiliar and trying to understand it. Mia stopped at a supermarket along the way and bought a meal deal, a sandwich, a bag of crisps, and a drink for a little over 700 yen with the store's loyalty card price. Breath. Sora stood in the aisle and looked at the price with something that felt, after the day they'd had, very much like relief. He chose salt and vinegar crisps, which were sharp enough to make his eyes water slightly, and ate half the bag on the way up in the elevator. They sat on the edges of their narrow beds with the sandwiches in their laps, and the room was quiet, and the street outside was quieter still, or at least it seemed that way through the glass. The city's voice softened to a low and distant murmur. Pause. Mia remembered, much later, that the sandwich had been a little dry, and that neither of them had mentioned it at the time. Sora told her the salt and vinegar crisps had made everything seem better than it was. She admitted that was probably true. That night, Sora lay on his narrow hotel mattress and listened to the sounds of London settling, the low hum of the building's ventilation, the murmur of a street below, something distant and unidentifiable that might have been the city simply breathing. Pause. He found himself thinking about all the plans he had made in that small apartment back home, the careful routing through Beijing, the instant noodles removed from the suitcase one by one, the voltage converter, the adapter, the afternoon tea that still had not happened. None of it had gone quite as imagined. And yet here he was, in London, in a room above a street in a city that had been here for centuries before anyone had thought to invent exchange rates or loyalty card prices, with Mia asleep in the other bed and tomorrow still entirely unopened. Pause. The city had taken more from his wallet than he had planned to give. But it had given him other things, the weight and quiet of the British Museum's air, the sound of a market in full afternoon voice, the particular flavor of something eaten while tired and far from home, the small rubber pharaoh duck that Mia had set on the nightstand between their beds, watching over them both. He drifted, in the way that very tired people drift, without quite deciding to pause. The yen was still weak, and London was still expensive, and the morning would bring more of both. But the room was warm, and Mia was nearby, and the city outside held all of its long centuries quietly, the way old cities do at night, patient, unhurried, waiting for the next day to find its own shape. And that, perhaps, is where we leave him for tonight, resting at last, after 35 hours of traveling and a city's worth of small, gentle surprises, in a narrow bed somewhere in London, with the whole island breathing softly around him, and no particular plans until morning. And so we leave that hallway behind, its shadows settling quietly as old houses do when the last footstep has passed. There is no hurry now. If you find your breath has slowed, your shoulders softened, that is exactly as it should be. Take a moment here, in the gentle space between one story and the next. Breathe in slowly, and let it go. Our next story takes us to a quieter setting, a small room, ordinary and unhurried, where the details are soft and the air carries the faint warmth of an evening lamp. There is nothing to hold on to, nothing to carry forward. Only the sound of this voice, and the easy drift of wherever sleep is taking you. Somewhere in the wide and wandering world of food stories, someone once found themselves lingering over a most unusual recipe, small silver fish, their heads rising through a golden pastry crust, their eyes turned softly upward as though searching for something in the night sky. The name of this dish was as lovely as it was strange. Stargazy pie, meaning something like the pie that watches the stars, and it came from the old fishing villages of Cornwall, from families who had learned, across many generations, to waste nothing and to find a kind of rough honesty in using everything the sea provided. Near it in memory sat other dishes, the soft, cold wobble of gelid eels, once loved in the East End of London, and the famous haggis of Scotland, that preparation of sheep's offal and oatmeal and spice, which had once moved a French president to murmur, with a certain diplomatic weariness, that a nation so willing to eat such a thing was rather difficult to fully trust. Pause. The response from the British side, it was said, was mild and untroubled. The Foreign Secretary simply noted that on the matter of haggis, the French president was not entirely wrong, and the small diplomatic moment passed without leaving any permanent wound. These wry little stories about food, the kind that wander across dinner tables and late-night conversations and old letters written home, were never really about contempt or mockery. They were more like gentle wonderings, the kind that arise when two island nations look across the distance at one another and notice how very differently they have answered the same essential, daily question: what shall we eat tonight, and where on earth did we learn to make it this way? Pause. To understand why, one needs to begin somewhere unexpected, not in a kitchen, and not at a dinner table, but on a map, and specifically at the thin horizontal lines of latitude that cross the northern hemisphere like invisible threads drawn around a spinning globe. Britain sits at 50 degrees north latitude or above, which is a number that means very little on its own until you hold it beside something more familiar, and realize that Japan's northernmost inhabited island, a cold and windswept place called Itarofu, rests at only 45 degrees north further south, in other words, than London. To be situated above Japan's northernmost point, and yet to remain a temperate and inhabited civilization rather than a frozen one, requires a certain kind of luck with the climate, and Britain has had exactly that, a remarkable, almost improbable stroke of oceanic good fortune that has kept the islands far warmer than their latitude would otherwise allow. Breath. The reason is a current, a slow and enormous river of warm water moving north across the Atlantic from somewhere near the Gulf of Mexico, carrying the accumulated warmth of tropical seas into latitudes where, without it, ice would dominate and the prevailing westerly winds carry that warmth ashore across the British Isles throughout all 4 seasons, like a persistent gift from distant water. Meteorologists call this a temperate oceanic climate, which means winters that rarely freeze hard and rarely stretch too long, summers that stay mild and seldom burn, and rainfall distributed in modest amounts throughout the year, less rain, actually, than the old stereotype suggests, and more sunshine in summer than many visitors arriving with umbrellas tend to expect. A visitor arriving in London in late July might be surprised to find the sun still setting after 9 o'clock in the evening, the sky still pale and luminous long after dinner, the park still full of people moving slowly through what feels like prolonged afternoon light. Pause. And yet, the same visitor arriving in December would find something quite different, the sun rising late, perhaps not until 8:30 in the morning, and sinking again below the horizon by 4 in the afternoon, leaving long, soft hours of grey and diffuse light that felt less like true day and more like a prolonged, gentle dusk that simply never quite resolved itself into anything brighter. This compression of winter daylight, more than the cold, more than the rain, more than anything else in the climate, was the quiet force that shaped, century after century, what Britain could and could not grow. Many crops, asparagus among them, a vegetable that is planted in the cold months and left to sleep underground, drawing slowly on whatever light winter offers before pushing upward through the soil in spring, need those short winter days to be touched, at least a little, by real and sustained sunlight. Pause. In Japan, even in winter, the sun rises at an angle steep enough to sustain that slow underground work. In Britain, the winter sun often barely clears the horizon before beginning its retreat again, and that difference, measured not in storms or frost but simply in minutes of usable light each day, accumulated over an entire growing season into a profound and lasting limitation on what the kitchen had to work with. Crops that elsewhere grew with relative ease would struggle in the British winter, or simply decline to grow at all, and since the technologies that might have extended the growing season, greenhouses, artificial light, rapid refrigeration, long-distance transport, were not available for most of Britain's history, the kitchen had to make do with what the land and the season together allowed. Breath. There was a secondary effect from this winter scarcity, quieter but just as consequential, because the cold months made it so difficult to grow many kinds of food. Farmers had to think very carefully about what they planted during the summer months as well, and the answer they arrived at across many generations of patient trial and cold disappointment was not variety but durability. Summer crops in Britain tended, of necessity, toward the starchy and the storable root vegetables that could be kept through winter in cool stone cellars, grains that dried and held their goodness for months, and potatoes, introduced later from the Americas, which could endure in the ground long past harvest and be eaten in 100 plain ways through the long lean season. There was not much room, in this careful calculus of survival, for the fragrant herbs of Provence, or the slow ripening tomatoes of the Italian south, or the complex layerings of spice that had transformed the cooking of warmer lands, and so the British kitchen remained, for a very long time, essentially simple, built for warmth and sufficiency rather than exploration or delight. Pause. The word that drifts to mind, when thinking about those old kitchens, is perhaps humble, food made to feed and sustain, to warm hands and fill a stomach at the end of a long grey winter day, made without ceremony or aspiration, in the way that all practical things are made when the margin for comfort is narrow and the cold is patient. The second reason lay even deeper than the weather, beneath the topsoil itself, in the mineral composition of the ground on which everything either grew or refused to grow. Soil scientists have given names to the different kinds of earth that cover the world's surface, names like Chernozem, the rich dark soil of the great Ukrainian plains, and the warm brown forest soils that cover much of Japan's mountainous interior, supporting the pine and cedar and the rice paddies that run along the valley floors. Most of Britain, with the exception of a narrow strip in the far south, is covered by something called podzol, a word borrowed from Russian, meaning something close to ash soil, and the name is quietly descriptive. Beneath a thin surface layer of organic matter, podzol is pale and almost grey, washed clean of the minerals and nutrients that make farming straightforward. Pause. Podzol is not barren in the way a desert is barren, things do grow in it, but it is, in the language of farming, ungenerous, producing some things and not others, tending toward the hardy and the plain rather than the lush and the varied. A traveler moving from northern France into southern England might sense this difference almost without being told. The French countryside with its rolling golden fields and hedgerows thick with growth, set against the English landscape's more restrained palette, green and soft and genuinely beautiful, but given more to pasture than to arable land, more to animals grazing quietly than to produce ripening in rows. The reason France sits so rich with farming while Britain does not, though they face each other across a narrow channel of water, goes back much further than any human history, all the way to the last great ice age, a long cold epoch that ended roughly 10,000 years before the first cities were built anywhere on Earth. Breath. During that ice age, glacier covered most of northern Europe in a vast, slow-moving mass of ice, an almost unimaginable landscape, white and still and silent in every direction, the shapes of hills and valleys buried beneath hundreds of meters of frozen water, the world beneath it grinding slowly, patiently, away. A glacier is not simply cold, it is enormously heavy and extraordinarily patient, and as it moves, even at the pace of a few inches per year, it scrapes and carries away whatever lies beneath it, including the accumulated fertility of millions of years of slowly weathered rock and decomposed organic matter, the deep richness that farming requires. When the ice retreated from Britain at the close of that long age, it carried much of that fertility with it, depositing it elsewhere, further south, into the sea, into the lowland plains of what is now France, and what remained on the British island was the pale, stripped-down podzol that farmers would inherit and work with for the next 10,000 years. Pause. Southern England, where the ice sheets had not extended quite as far, retained somewhat richer soil, and this exception maps almost precisely onto the regions where British agriculture has historically been most productive and most varied. But for most of the island, the Ice Age had made its quiet, permanent mark, and no amount of human effort could restore in a few thousand years what the glacier had carried away over tens of thousands. The people who worked this land made the only sensible choice available to them. If the soil would not easily support crops in their full and varied range, they would raise animals instead, and the wet and mild climate, so unsuitable for Mediterranean wheat or French vines, turned out to be nearly ideal for grass. Grass grows on podzol. Grass grows in cool and moist air. Grass grows through mild winters and long soft summers, and the animals that eat grass, cattle and sheep and goats, convert that humble fodder into something quite rich. Milk and cream and butter and cheese, wool and meat. The quiet warmth of a herd standing still in a field at evening. Pause. British dairy, as a result, became genuinely excellent over the centuries, and British beef in particular developed a reputation that even the most skeptical foreign observers found difficult to dismiss. The animals raised on the cool, wet pastures of England and Scotland, producing a depth of flavor that seemed to hold something of the landscape within it, something grassy and honest and cold. Roast beef became one of the few British dishes celebrated beyond the islands, and if the preparation was simple, if it lacked the sauces and reductions of a French kitchen, or the spice architecture of a great curry, that simplicity was perhaps also the point, a way of trusting the quality of the ingredient rather than dressing it in things it did not need. Pause. There were other reasons too, folded into this geography like pressed flowers kept between the pages of a history book, reasons that came from human decisions as much as from the land. In the middle decades of the 17th century, a religious movement called Puritanism had taken hold across parts of England, and among its many quiet teachings was a wariness of pleasure, including the pleasure of food, the sense that elaborate cooking was a kind of vanity, and that plain fare, eaten without ceremony, was more in keeping with a worthy and humble life. Then came the long years of conflict with France, when the cultural exchange that might have carried French techniques and French flavors across the Channel was instead suspended, replaced by a deliberate turning away from things that seemed too Gallic, too refined, too fond of its own ornamentation. Breath. And then came the Industrial Revolution, which moved millions of people from the countryside into the cities, and where the traditional knowledge of growing and preserving and slow cooking, accumulated across generations of working close to the soil, did not always survive the journey into crowded urban rooms and factory schedules. All of these forces, working together across several centuries, shaped a food culture that was restrained and unpretentious, sometimes monotonous, and occasionally, for visitors arriving from places with richer culinary histories, something of a quiet disappointment, though never, perhaps, entirely deserving the mild contempt that the old jokes suggested. But the person who came to Britain now, in this more recent chapter of the island's long and continuing story, would find something quite different from the grey stews and cold pies that those jokes described. Pause. London had become one of the most culinarily diverse cities on earth, a place where communities from across the old empire and the wider world had settled over the decades, and where each of those communities had eventually, quietly, opened restaurants and markets and small shops that brought flavors the island had never grown into neighborhoods that had once smelled only of coal and wool. Japanese food had become particularly beloved, with ramen counters and sushi bars and places that felt genuinely like stepping sideways into Tokyo for an hour, appearing throughout the neighborhoods of the city, some maintaining careful Japanese traditions, others blending those traditions with local ingredients into something new and worth returning to. Borough Market, near the Thames, had become a place where small producers from across Britain and the continent gathered every week, and where a person could taste the crumble of a real cheddar cheese aged in Somerset cellars, or find a thick burger of British beef with cheese that had been made perhaps 50 miles away, and eat it standing in the open air beside the river, with the sound of water nearby. Pause. The supermarkets had changed too, carrying fresh vegetables from Spain and France, olive oil from Italy, ingredients that the old podzol soil of the island had never been asked to produce, the gaps in the native larder gently supplemented now by the generosity of other climates, other soils, other people's long cultivation and patience. The glacier had stripped away Britain's fertility 10,000 years before anyone was there to notice, and the island had built what it could from what remained, over many cold centuries, arriving at a kitchen that was honest if not always inspired, reliable if not always remarkable. And onto that plain foundation, over the past several decades, the world had added new colors and new conversations, the way a simple room, over time, fills slowly with things brought home from other places, and becomes somewhere particular and warm. Breath. The story of why British food became what it became was never really a story of failure, it was a story of geography, of what the land offered and what the long winter withheld, of ice and ocean current and the particular angle of winter sun at 50 degrees north, of people doing what they could with what they had been given. The stargazy pie, with its fish heads tilted toward the sky through the pastry, was made by fishing families who wasted nothing, and who found a kind of rough affection in using every part of what the cold sea provided, and if that was strange by some standards, it was also, in its way, deeply faithful to the place and the season and the need. And perhaps that faithfulness, to the land, to the weather, to the particular pale light of a winter afternoon on a northern island surrounded by sea, was something worth carrying gently into sleep tonight, the way we carry small, unexpected facts that turn out, on reflection, to feel rather like kindness. Pause. And that, perhaps, is where this chapter rests for tonight, somewhere on a green island, in the quiet of an old kitchen where the kettle has been set to boil, and the cattle in the field outside have settled for the evening, and the long grey winter sky is releasing, very softly, the last of its light. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting it fade like a half-remembered dream, soft at the edges, already dissolving. There is no need to hold on to it. If you like, you may take a slow breath now in through the nose, and out, unhurried, easy, and feel the weight of the night settle a little more gently around you. There is nowhere you need to be. Our next story takes us to a quieter setting, a place where the pace slows even further, where the air is still and the world outside has grown very far away. Rest here for just a moment, right at the threshold, and when you are ready, we will step forward together. Somewhere in the long, slow middle of a January evening, someone sat at a desk and wrote a small invitation out into the world. The message was warm and unhurried, asking that anyone who had ever wanted to learn about black tea really learn it, not merely drink it, should come and sit for a while and share what they knew. Questions were welcome, the poster said softly, about how to brew, about which brands were worth seeking, about whether a good teacup made any difference to the experience. And so they came, one by one and then several at once, these quiet enthusiasts of the leaf, settling into the thread the way people once settled into chairs drawn near a common lamp on a winter night. The one who had started it, whose name in the thread suggested something like motion or welcome, had thought ahead, and before the first question arrived, had written out the full and careful ritual of making a proper pot. Pause. 4 cups, the post began, using an Earl Grey as the foundation, that bergamot-scented blend, named after a 19th-century British Prime Minister and loved in kitchens from London to Osaka, a familiar place from which anyone might set out. First, the teapot itself had to be warmed, hot water poured in, swirled once or twice against the walls of the ceramic, and then discarded, so that the cold pot would not pull the heat away from the water that followed. This step, the post observed, was more important than most people realized, and it is the kind of knowledge that only arrives through having made many pots and noticed, over the slow accumulation of quiet evenings, the small but real difference that warmth inside the vessel makes. Then fresh water, measured carefully for 4 cups, was brought to a full, rolling boil in a kettle. The leaves were measured into the warmed pot, 2 caddy spoons, the small oval-bowled measure that serious tea people keep near their tins, or 4 level teaspoons if no caddy spoon could be found in the drawer. 1 caddy spoon, the post noted gently, was generally enough for 2 cups, so the arithmetic of tea is not complicated, just worth knowing. Pause. The boiling water followed, poured all at once into the waiting pot, and then the 3 minutes and 25 seconds began, a duration arrived at through many patient evenings of experiment, not quite 3.5 minutes, not quite 3, but something settled and specific, tested and trusted. While the tea steeped, a tea cozy was placed over the pot, that fabric cover, often knitted from wool or sewn from cotton or linen, shaped to fit the pot's shoulders, sometimes decorated with small stitched patterns of birds or leaves or simple geometric forms. The tea cozy existed, the post observed, not only as a practical object but as a kind of companion to the pot, something that had been made with affection and that gave warmth quietly in return, asking nothing. If no cozy was at hand, a clean towel wrapped firmly around the pot would serve, the point being only that the heat should not escape too soon, that the leaves needed warmth and time working together to give what they held. Breath. After 3 minutes and 25 seconds, a single stir, just once, with a spoon, slow and even, to settle the strength of the brew before the first cup was poured. No more than once, the post was careful to say, because more than that changes something in the texture of the liquid, introduces a roughness that restraint keeps away. This was the English method of making tea, leaves remaining in the pot throughout, the brew deepening as the minutes continued to pass, so that the first cup might be taken plain and clear and bright, and the second with a splash of cold milk to soften what had grown stronger in the interval. The French method, also described in some detail, involved 2 pots rather than 1, and a fine mesh filter. The tea was poured from the steeping vessel into a second vessel after the allotted time, the leaves left behind, so that the strength of the brew remained constant from the first cup to the last. Pause. Both methods had their reasons, the post concluded, and both were correct within their own traditions, which is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about any careful way of making something good. The thread began to fill. Long pause. Someone recalled buying the seasonal mystery assortment boxes from Lupicia, a Japanese specialty tea shop known for its wide and sometimes unexpected range of flavored and single-origin teas, and mentioned that there were leaves at home from several years past their printed date, kept out of something that was neither carelessness nor thrift, but a kind of quiet attachment to past enthusiasms. Another voice in the thread understood exactly this. that when one buys tea with more zeal than can be matched by daily consumption, the tins accumulate, and the accumulation becomes its own small archive. Someone else said they knew the feeling well, that tea bought in abundance for solitary drinking was simply more than one person could get through, and that perhaps the only real solution was to bring more people into the habit, to make the pleasure shared. There was warmth in that observation. Somewhere, the thought that a solitary pleasure, offered outward, might become a household pleasure, and then something wider still. The conversation turned, as such conversations tend to, toward the question of which brands were worth the seeking. Pause. Fortnum and Mason was recommended, that old London house whose shop has been blending tea since the 18th century, and whose tins, pale and decorated in careful colors, are themselves a pleasure to set on a shelf and look at. Mariage Frères of Paris was named as well, whose teas could be found in Japan through certain specialty shops and through the second-hand market, and who packed their blends in handsome metal canisters already suited for long storage. For a first purchase, for someone just beginning, Fortnum's Earl Grey Classic was mentioned as a reliable companion, not extravagant in its complexity, but genuinely good, the bergamot clean and not too sharp, the base blend steady and reassuring. Darjeeling came into the conversation with a kind of gentle solemnity, because Darjeeling, that tea from the fog-covered hills of West Bengal, grown at altitude in gardens that have been tended for generations, is a subject that opens quickly into many smaller subjects. Breath. The first flush, the spring picking, comes with a particular brightness, light in the cup, almost green in character, floral and delicate in a way that seems to carry something of the coolness of the air in which the leaves were gathered. The second flush, picked in summer when the weather has settled and the plants have grown full, carries more body and something that tea people describe as muscatel, a sweetness sometimes compared to ripe muscat grapes, round and rich, the cup more substantial than what came before. The autumnal harvest, called the outturn, arrives at the year's turning with a settled warmth, a mellowness that some find more approachable than the more celebrated earlier pickings, the flavor sweeter and gentler at the edges. All of this, the thread noted with a fond and genuine admiration, also varied according to which particular estate the tea had been grown on, which garden, which slope, which year, so that Darjeeling became something very close to a study in how place and season and human attention combined to make a flavor that could not have come from anywhere else. Pause. Someone admitted, with the tone of someone fond of their own limits, that the people who had gone deep into Darjeeling were perhaps a category unto themselves, that the specificity of their knowledge could make a newcomer feel they had wandered into an advanced seminar rather than a friendly gathering. But this was noted without any sharpness, more as an acknowledgement that some pleasures do run very deep, and that there was no obligation for anyone to follow them all the way to the bottom. The subject of teacups arrived in the thread with the quiet weight that good objects tend to carry. Long pause. Narumi was mentioned, a Japanese manufacturer of Western-style bone china based in the city of Nagoya, whose cups have appeared on tables in Japan and abroad for nearly a century, and whose work manages to be both delicate and practical in the particular way that well-made things often are. Someone said that Narumi cups were easy to love for practical as well as aesthetic reasons, lighter than they appeared, comfortable to hold, the surface of the porcelain so smooth that it was a small pleasure simply to wrap one's hands around them on a cool morning. Another voice mentioned having a cup from a Scandinavian porcelain house, a fine piece, well made, and realizing only recently that it had sat unwashed and unused at the back of a cabinet, and felt a small, forgiving recognition at this fact, that beautiful things can fall into disuse without anyone intending it. Pause. Someone asked whether a good teacup actually made any difference to the experience of drinking, and the thread considered this with seriousness for a moment. The answer that emerged was yes, and also something more than yes. The design made the ritual feel intentional, the quality of the material kept the tea at a better temperature, and the weight and balance of a good cup in the hand changed the quality of the attention one brought to the act of drinking. But even those who agreed on all of this admitted that they had brewed in ordinary mugs plenty of times, and that the tea had been good then too, and that perhaps the cup was less the source of pleasure than the occasion for noticing what pleasure already existed. Breath. A small and reliable discovery surfaced in the thread that several people said they tended to forget and rediscover with genuine delight each time, that black tea and green tea and oolong and white tea all begin as leaves from the same plant, Camellia sinensis, and that what separates them is not the plant itself but what the maker chooses to do with the leaves after they have been picked. How long the leaves are allowed to rest and oxidize, whether they are heated quickly to stop that process or left to continue, how they are rolled or compressed or dried in the sun, these decisions by human hands over many generations are what divide a pale, grassy green tea from a deep, warm black tea, and everything that falls in the long and varied space between. Someone said that they forgot this regularly and were newly amazed by it each time they encountered it again, which the thread agreed was a particular kind of pleasure, the renewable wonder, the fact that keeps its capacity to surprise. The matter of storage came up as a gentle practical concern, since tea leaves fade in heat and humidity and direct light, and anyone who accumulates more than can be drunk within a week or two has to think about where the collection lives. Pause. A sealed tin, ideally opaque, was the general recommendation, and the thread noted with appreciation that some of the better houses packaged their teas in metal canisters that were already excellent for long-term storage, so the purchase and the preservation arrived together in the same transaction. Mariage Frères was praised specifically for this. The tins, already beautiful and already airtight, needed nothing added to them, and could be refilled from other sources once they were empty, so the container outlasted many contents. Someone mentioned reusing the storage tins from a familiar Japanese pantry brand, a tin bearing an elephant on its label, the kind that is quietly repurposed in many Japanese households for biscuits and buttons and all manner of small kept things, and found it suited the purpose of tea storage perfectly. A Ziploc bag, several voices offered, was the practical minimum, not beautiful, but effective, and the difference it made in preserving a summer-bought tea past August was real and worth the small effort of sealing it well. Pause. Summer brought its own branch of the conversation, the cold brew, which required no heat at all, only patience and the quiet work of the refrigerator overnight. Tea leaves placed in cold water and left to rest for a full day produced a flavor that was different from hot brewed tea, gentler in its astringency, softer at the edges, a version of the same drink rendered in cooler, more forgiving light. Someone remembered being served a cold-brewed Earl Grey at a hotel, a calm and pleasant place, and finding it sweeter than anything that label had previously suggested to them, sweet in a way that stayed in the memory long after the afternoon itself had dissolved. The question of milk arrived in the thread as it always does in discussions of British-style tea, and with it the patient disagreement that has accompanied the subject for longer than anyone now living can recall. Breath. Some in the thread added milk to the empty cup before pouring the tea, following an older tradition that had its advocates. Some poured the tea first and added milk after, following practice and preference, and no position was pressed on anyone, because this was that kind of gathering open and without insistence. The more important point, several voices came to agree, was that the tea itself needed to be properly steeped before any milk was introduced, that hot water, genuinely hot and freshly boiled, was required to draw the flavor and the warmth fully from the leaves, and that milk added to improperly brewed tea could only soften what was already thin. Warming the milk beforehand was mentioned as a refinement that made a real difference in the final cup, keeping the temperature even, avoiding the small shock of cold against something hot, though most in the thread acknowledged they did not bother with it at home on an ordinary evening, and found the cup was still good. Pause. There was something easy and forgiving about that recognition, that the ideal and the comfortable practice were not always the same thing, and that both had their place depending on the hour and the mood and how much time the kettle had already been allowed to occupy one's attention. The atlas of brands that the thread had collectively assembled by this point was generous and varied. Ahmed from England, whose fruity blends had gathered a quiet following among those who liked something a little lighter. Fortune from Paris, whose apple tea someone mentioned as a daily ritual drunk every morning without reflection, the way a habit becomes part of the shape of a day. Jeannat, another French house, whose teas had a reputation for reliability, was cited as a brand one returned to when the hour was late and the mood was not adventurous, the kind of tea that never disappointed by being exactly what it promised to be. Marco Polo, from Mariage Frères, a blend named for the traveler and drawing on Chinese and Tibetan origins, touched with flowers and a softness of fruit, was named by one voice as the flavored tea they returned to above all others, a cup that felt like a very specific kind of comfort. Pause. Twinings was mentioned as well, readily available in most Japanese supermarkets, approachable and honest, and someone noted with mild interest that a foreigner had once commented that the Twinings sold in Japan tasted lighter than the same brand at home, which suggested the blend had been adjusted for the local water, Japan's soft water drawing flavor differently than the harder water of English cities. This led to a brief and pleasant digression about water itself, that the mineral content of the water one uses changes the character of the tea in ways most drinkers never notice, and that what tastes correct in one place may taste quite different somewhere else, even from the same tin and the same measure. Breath. The conversation wandered toward oolong and found its way, through recommendation and gentle curiosity, to Tieguanian, a famous variety of semi-oxidized tea that exists in two distinct forms, one from Anshi in Fujian province, China, where it carries a fragrance compared to osmanthus blossom, delicate and floral, and one from Muzha in Taiwan, where it has something more citrus in its character, brighter and more immediate. Several voices said they had come to these teas through the thread itself, or through following curiosity from one cup to the next over many months, and that each new tea had opened something rather than simply added to a list. Someone who had once brewed masala chai in a saucepan, whole spices cracked and steeped with milk and water and tea leaves over a low flame, filling a small kitchen with warmth and something almost festive, mentioned this as a past chapter, a thing they had done and set aside, but remembered as one remembers anything that was taken seriously for a time. And then the thread found what felt like a natural resting place, not a conclusion exactly, but the gradual fullness that comes when enough has been shared and received, when the cup has been passed around and each person has taken something from it. Pause. A late arrival posted that they had read everything from the beginning and found it genuinely useful, and planned to try 1 or 2 things that coming weekend, probably starting with the warming of the pot. The response came warmly and without ceremony. Thank you for reading, and welcome, and now you are part of this too. That is the particular quality of tea as a shared subject, that the knowledge belonging to one person does not diminish when it passes to another, that the pleasure of the cup is not made smaller by being explained, that the gathering around it is itself part of what makes it good. The thread had been, in the end, a kind of gathering, the way a kitchen table on a winter afternoon is a gathering, not requiring anything of anyone, simply a place where the warmth was, and where anyone inclined to sit might find something worth carrying away. Pause. Somewhere, at this hour, someone is warming a teapot before filling it, pouring the hot water in and swirling it once and setting it aside. Somewhere, a hand reaches for a tin with a familiar label, and something bergamot or earthy or faintly floral rises into the air of a quiet room. The water comes to its gentle boil. The cozy waits on the counter, soft and ready. And the evening settles around all of it, unhurried and content, the way evenings do when something warm is being made and there is no need to be anywhere else. Breath. And that, perhaps, is where this chapter rests for tonight. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting its shadows dissolve quietly, like breath on a winter morning. There is no hurry now. If you need a moment, take one, let your shoulders sink a little deeper, let the weight of the day settle further away from you. Breathe in slowly, and release. The night is patient, and so are we. Our next story takes us to a quieter setting, a small countryside town, where the rice fields stretch wide under a pale moon, and the only sound is the distant call of a night bird finding its way home. Rest here for just a breath longer, and when you are ready, let that image come gently to you. Somewhere in the long, unhurried winter of December 2008, in the anonymity of an internet forum, a man who had once been a butler sat down and answered questions. The forum was known as 2channel, which was then Japan's largest anonymous message board, a place where millions of voices overlapped without names, without faces, without the weight of formality or the soft necessity of a bow. Someone had simply posted an invitation, a former butler, willing to answer whatever anyone wished to know. And so the questions arrived, slowly at first, then in a soft, steady stream, like winter rain finding its way into a courtyard garden. Many of the questions, he would later remember with something like warm amusement, came from young people who had grown up with anime and manga, who carried in their minds a very specific image of what a butler was: silver-haired, impossibly composed, capable of catching a thrown knife midair with the flat of a silver serving tray. He answered these gently, without correction that felt like correction. The most impressive thing he could do with a piece of silverware, he said softly, was to wash 100 dishes within the time it took most people to wash 10, without leaving a single mark or water spot on any of them, and if even one piece was imperfect when he held it to the light, he would begin the whole row again. The forum visitors found this funny and warm and a little surprising, in the way that reality often is when it turns out to be more interesting than the story everyone had already decided on. He had been a butler for 3 years, serving a company president in Tokyo, a man of considerable position and considerable reserve, who wanted, above almost all other things, ordinary home cooking. Not elaborate dishes, not the studied refinements of expensive restaurant menus. Simple food, the kind that carried the smell of childhood in its steam, the kind that a careful mother might prepare on a rainy weekday evening with whatever happened to be in the refrigerator. 2 maids worked in the household alongside him, and it was they who handled the cooking, and they made it well. His working hours ran from 8 in the morning until the president had finished his evening meal, which came usually at around 7, though the house had its own slow rhythms and the days sometimes stretched a little longer or settled a little shorter, following the mood of the work and the season and the small, unnamed necessities that any household accumulates over time. He did not live in. Pause. When each evening ended, he returned to his own apartment, and that quiet interval, that small, private distance between service and self, was something he had found he genuinely needed, a space where he could stop being a butler and simply be a person who was tired and had washed a great many dishes. Someone in the thread asked about his uniform, and he described it plainly, something in the manner of a tuxedo, with a necktie, formal in the way that a certain kind of film suggested formality, though in the actual household it had felt less like a costume and more like a second skin, something he put on at 8 in the morning and set quietly aside each evening at the door. The white gloves that anime butlers invariably seemed to wear, he had never worn. Pause. That particular detail had migrated from fiction into the public imagination and stayed there, growing more elaborate with each retelling, until the reality of a man in an ordinary tuxedo rewashing a row of plates felt almost disappointingly plain by comparison. He did not seem to find it disappointing. After the evening meal had been cleared and the kitchen had gone quiet and the last plates were stacked and clean, there was a small, unhurried pocket of time before the end of the working day, and in that time the household gathered in a way that the people reading the thread found difficult to fit into their existing image of what a formal household would look like. The maids would put on tea, and sometimes the president himself would come and sit with them in his shirt sleeves at the kitchen table, and they would all drink together, and the conversation would find its own level, easy and without the careful gradations of hierarchy that the rest of the day had required. This, he observed, was the detail that seemed to surprise people most, that a life in service could contain, in the quieter hours, something that simply felt like company. Not every part of the work was like that. Pause. There was a story he offered reluctantly, only after a good deal of patient encouragement, and even then he told it in the measured, careful way of someone who had revisited the memory many times and had not entirely finished with it. The president had kept a dog for many years, an old dog, the kind that had grown grey around the muzzle and slow in its movements in the way that very loved animals do, quietly and without drawing attention to the process, until one afternoon while the president was away at work, the dog simply did not wake from the warm patch of light where it had been sleeping near the window. The veterinarian said it was age, natural and complete. But when the president came home that evening and heard what had happened, something in him, something that grief produces in even the most composed of people, something that has nothing to do with logic or fairness, needed somewhere to go. Pause. He expressed his anger toward the household staff, and told them they had not been watchful enough. The butler recalled this without resentment, or at least without anything in his telling that wished to sound like resentment, because somewhere in the years that had passed since then he had come to understand something about what the president had been carrying in that moment. Grief, he had found, often needs a direction to face, even when the direction is wrong, even when everyone present understands, quietly, in the part of themselves that does not speak, that the direction is wrong. The president would have known, in the stillness that came afterward, that what he had said was not quite fair, and the butler, for his part, had stood quietly and received what could not be placed elsewhere, and later had brought tea and something small and sweet from the kitchen, and the household had slowly found its temperature again. This, he said, was a part of the work that no one talked about in the forums and no one described in the manga, the willingness to receive what a grieving person cannot hold alone, and to hold it gently, without adding to its weight. Pause. He had grieved for the dog as well, he mentioned, and he did not say whether there had been a space in which he was permitted to show that. There was another story, smaller and brighter, buried in the thread the way a smooth stone can be buried in the bed of a stream, easy to miss, and warm to the touch if you happen to reach it. Someone asked whether there had ever been anything in the course of his work that might be called a romance, and he paused before answering, in a way that those following the thread mentioned they could feel even through the silence of text on a screen. The president's daughter had telephoned him once on a day when he was not working, to ask whether he might spend some of his afternoon helping her choose a birthday present for her father. She was 18 at the time, and he was 23. Pause. He drove to collect her in what he described with gentle, self-aware humor as a rather old and undistinguished vehicle, a compact car of no particular prestige, the kind that looked faintly apologetic when parked in front of the kind of households he usually moved through. She told him the car was perfectly fine, and he had been grateful for this in a way that stayed with him. They moved through several shops together in the easy, focused way of people engaged in a shared task that matters to them, considering options with quiet seriousness, picking things up and putting them down, and gradually narrowing toward something right. Afterward, because the afternoon had grown comfortable and neither of them was in a hurry to end it, he took her to his favorite ramen shop, one of those small, warm places that smells of long-simmered broth and wood smoke, where the counter seats are close together and the owner knows the regulars by their orders. She had ordered without hesitation, and this was the detail he came back to most readily, not the shops or the conversation or the way the afternoon had felt, but the simple fact of her ordering simply, as if a ramen counter on an ordinary afternoon was exactly where she had always meant to be. Pause. Over the course of that day, his earlier assumptions about her, the ones he had not quite known he was carrying, about how a company president's daughter would hold herself in the world, had been quietly and completely revised. She was knowledgeable, in the way of someone who reads carefully and thinks about what she has read, and she wore this lightly, as something for her own use rather than for display, and she was genuinely easy to spend an afternoon with. The people following the thread grew very interested in this story and pressed for more details, and he replied with warmth, and with the patient affection of someone recounting something they have decided to remember as a gift rather than a loss. She was the president's daughter. He was the president's butler. Some arrangements in a life have their own logic, and that logic does not bend simply because an afternoon was pleasant and a bowl of ramen was eaten in good company. Pause. He had put the memory somewhere he could keep it, not as a loss, he said, but as a thing that had existed and been worth existing. The conversation in the thread drifted, as conversations do, toward the future. He recalled that the president had said something to him once, at a moment he had not been expecting it, something that had the feeling of simple encouragement at the time, but which had continued to work in him in the weeks and months that followed, the way certain words do when they come from someone whose judgment you have quietly learned to trust. The president had told him to keep his vision wide, to always be reaching toward something further than where he currently stood, and this, the butler said, had settled in him like a seed that took a season to understand. He had begun to think about England, about the schools there that trained butlers in the formal tradition, institutions that had existed for generations and taught methods that went well beyond anything in a manga, and about what it might mean to complete that training and then find work in households where the craft had a longer history than it did in Japan. He told the president his thinking, and the president nodded without hesitation and said yes, and even offered to let the butler remain in the house while he studied, to continue the work while he prepared. The butler declined this offer, thoughtfully, on the grounds that the household deserved his full attention or none of it, and that he could not divide himself between the two without shortchanging both. So now he was working at a coffee shop in the evenings and studying English in whatever time remained, accumulating the words the way one accumulates anything that matters, one at a time, without great hurry, with a reasonable faith that they would eventually add up to something. Pause. Someone in the thread asked whether English would really stop him, and he replied, quietly, that he expected he would find a way. Near the end of the thread, someone asked a question that was harder than the others, whether a person who spent their days attending entirely to the needs of others could sustain that posture, over years, without something souring in the interior. He thought about this before answering. He said that the way he understood his own position was not as an employee but as something more like a counterweight, not working for the president exactly, but alongside him, steadying certain things so that the president could hold other things steady, and neither of them quite in charge of the whole. This was, he said, the thought that made it possible to continue, the idea that kept the work from becoming only labor. And beneath all of it, beneath the long hours and the dishes washed to standard and the grief of a man who had lost his dog and needed somewhere to place it, beneath all of it he had found something uncomplicated. Pause. He was glad when the people around him were glad. When the president settled back from the table at the end of a good meal, and the kitchen was clean, and the maids were somewhere nearby with their tea, and the house had found its evening quiet in those moments, something in the butler was satisfied in a way he could not quite describe but had never felt any need to question. He said he thought that was enough, and he seemed, in the plain language of the thread, to genuinely mean it. The thread wound down the way threads wind down, gradually and without ceremony, the questions growing fewer, the pauses between replies growing longer, until the butler thanked everyone who had asked and the conversation simply settled into the archive, where it has rested quietly ever since. The record sits there in the long, accumulated memory of the internet, a winter conversation about silverware and white gloves and a dog sleeping in a patch of afternoon light, and a young man who had learned that the work of making someone glad was its own kind of answer to a question he had not known he was asking. Perhaps somewhere, in England or somewhere near it, a man who had once driven an undistinguished car to a ramen shop on a quiet Tokyo afternoon found a household that needed him, and settled into the long, patient work of keeping it well. Perhaps he is still looking. Pause. Perhaps the looking, too, is part of the work, the willingness to keep reaching toward something further, the way a person holds a dish to the light and, finding one imperfection, simply begins again. Either way, the winter evening of December 2008, when a former butler sat down in the anonymity of a forum and answered questions from strangers who had arrived expecting something from a manga and found instead something quieter and more lasting, remains somewhere in the long record of small, unhurried things, a thread about service and precision and the sound of a kettle that is already on before anyone has had to ask. And that, perhaps, is where this part of the story rests for tonight. And so we leave that hallway behind, its shadows settling quietly into memory, the way all things do when the night grows still enough. There is no hurry now. If you need to shift, to settle deeper into the warmth around you, please do. This moment belongs entirely to you. Let your breath find its own slow rhythm, in and out, easy and unheld. Our next story takes us to a quieter setting, a gentler place, where the pace of things is soft and unhurried, much like this very hour. We will arrive there together, in our own time. For now, simply rest. The stories will keep. Somewhere, on a small island at the western edge of the world, surrounded by the slow and restless movement of grey water, there has long been a tradition of eating plain things simply, and of finding in that plainness a kind of honesty that the rest of the world has never quite managed to understand. Such reputations, once they have settled themselves into the world, have a way of moving easily across great distances, and by the time this one arrived in Japan it had become something between a gentle, affectionate joke and a sincere curiosity, the question of why, with so much of the world within reach, the English had arrived at a cuisine that the world agreed was among the least celebrated of them all. Now and then, on slow evenings, this question would surface in online conversations, moving through many voices at once, the way a pleasant mystery does, not urgent, not pointed, simply worth sitting with for a while. Someone would mention it, and others would respond, and the thread would grow longer in the unhurried manner of people who have nowhere in particular they need to be, and who find a mild and companionable pleasure in the question itself. Many voices added their own small weight, their own memory or half-remembered observation, and slowly a picture formed, not a verdict, exactly, but a long and wandering meditation on food and history and the strange way that a country's cooking tends to reflect the century that most shaped it. British food, it was observed in the thread, had come to serve as a kind of shorthand for a certain approach to eating, food that sustained the body without making too many promises to the senses, food that did what it needed to do and did not ask for applause afterward. And yet, the thread noted with some care, things had perhaps improved somewhat in recent years, as the world had grown smaller and the island more willing to borrow flavors from its neighbors, though on this point the voices were divided, as they usually are when the subject is close to someone's memory of a particular meal eaten in a particular place and time that cannot quite be revisited. Someone recalled a restaurant visit to England, a meal that had been, by their careful and diplomatic reckoning, not quite edible by any standard they had previously known, and this memory was met with the kind of quiet, knowing sympathy the internet reserves for experiences that need no further elaboration. Another voice offered a simpler and more memorable summary, that if one wished to eat well in England, one should eat breakfast 3 times each day and entrust the other meals to those with considerably stronger constitutions. The full English breakfast, it seemed, was the one point on which everyone in the thread could find agreement, the one achievement the island had managed, against considerable culinary odds, to produce something genuinely worth sitting down to without reservation. One could imagine it laid out on a wide plate on a grey English morning. The sausages, which the photograph suggested had perhaps spent a little longer in the pan than strictly necessary, the thick-cut bacon curling at its edges, the fried egg with its soft and still trembling yolk, the dark-baked beans in their sweet red sauce, the slice of toast that had gone slightly cold by the time it reached the table, and the whole arrangement sitting together in a way that was not elegant but somehow honest. As a composition, it was not delicate in the way that Japanese food could be delicate. It did not speak of the season or arrange itself in small and beautiful portions on a low-lacquered tray, did not concern itself with the color of the bowl against the color of the broth, but it had a certain generosity to it, a willingness to fill and to warm, to carry a person through whatever grey morning waited on the other side of the kitchen door. The thread mentioned that this breakfast was not, in the daily life of an ordinary English person, eaten every morning. It was rather a Sunday ritual, a slow and unhurried meal taken when the week had finally paused long enough to allow something properly cooked, something worth sitting down to without glancing at the clock. On ordinary mornings, it seemed, the English made do with cereal, those pressed flakes of grain eaten with cold milk, which one member of the thread found quietly melancholy in a way they struggled to explain, the morning reduced to something that required nothing from anyone, not even the small effort of warming a pan. Beyond the breakfast, the culinary landscape grew more complicated, and the voices in the thread picked through it with a kind of gentle bewilderment that was never quite unkind, the way one examines a curious object that one cannot entirely place but does not wish to dismiss. Fish and chips occupied a middle ground in the discussion, not elegant, not refined, but something that had fed generations of cold and hungry people, and that had the honesty of simplicity about it. The way a few good things treated without pretension can still satisfy something in a person that a more elaborate dish sometimes fails to reach. Roast beef earned a cautious and genuine approval, the great slow roast, the meat tender and dark at the edges, the kitchen filling for hours with a warm and rising smell that promised something good at the end of the afternoon. The kind of meal that required patience and a quiet Sunday and something worth reading while the oven did its slow and steady work. But there were other dishes that gave the thread a longer pause, a preparation involving jellied eels, which was apparently a traditional London food dating back several centuries, to a time when the Thames was full of eels and the city was full of people who needed something inexpensive and close at hand. Someone had looked this dish up while reading the thread and found that it cold, grey, gelatinous, eaten with a splash of malt vinegar from a small white ceramic pot, had once been sold from carts through the narrow streets of working-class London, and this historical context somehow softened the strangeness of it, the way learning the history of almost anything tends to make it a little more legible, a little more human. Scotland had its own contribution to the conversation, in the form of haggis, a traditional dish made from sheep offal mixed with oatmeal and onion and herbs, cooked slowly and served on special occasions, which sounded, in bare description, alarming in the way that many traditional foods do when stripped of the circumstances and the cold winters that gave rise to them. England, similarly, offered black pudding, a dark and dense sausage made with pork blood and oats and spices, served as a matter of course alongside the great breakfast, and this too, described to someone unfamiliar with it, had a quality of confrontation, though those who had grown up with it seemed to find it perfectly ordinary, simply one more warm component in the morning's quiet ritual. The conversation turned, as conversations about British food eventually do, to the deeper question of why, in a country that had spent centuries sailing every ocean and encountering the cuisines of dozens of other nations, the food at home had remained so resolutely, so stubbornly, so almost philosophically plain. Several explanations moved through the thread, each one carrying its own weight and its own partial truth, and none of them quite sufficient on its own, in the way that the explanations for most historical things are never quite sufficient on their own. The first was poverty, not the poverty of individual households alone, though that played its role, but the particular and collective poverty that had come with the Industrial Revolution, when cities had filled very quickly with workers who needed food that was fast and cheap and required no skill or time to prepare, and the older arts of the kitchen had slowly retreated before the demands of the factory bell and the long working day. Before the revolution, it was suggested, there had been something richer, country cooking that followed the seasons, food that varied with the weather and the harvest and the animal that came to market on a given week, but the revolution had moved too quickly for that tradition to follow, and the tradition had not entirely found its way back in the centuries since. The second explanation was more philosophical in its nature, that the English approach to seasoning was simply different from other countries' approach, the underlying assumption being that each person at the table would complete the dish according to their own taste, adding salt or vinegar or mustard as they saw fit, and that the cook's responsibility ended at the stove rather than continuing all the way onto the plate. This was, some in the thread observed, a philosophy of a kind democratic, perhaps, in its way, leaving each person to finish their meal according to their own particular preference, but it made for a bewildering experience if one arrived at the table expecting the food to already have been thought about, seasoned, considered, delivered as an act of care rather than merely as a set of ingredients awaiting a verdict. The comparison with France and Italy arrived eventually, as it tends to in these conversations, and the thread moved through it with a mixture of genuine admiration and mild, affectionate exasperation that felt entirely natural to the subject. France and Italy were near neighbors, separated from England by not so very much water, and yet in matters of food they might as well have been at the far end of the known world. The warmth in the cooking, the olive oil and garlic and slow-simmered tomatoes, the wine that appeared at lunch as a matter of course, the long afternoons treated as a reasonable and worthy investment in something genuinely worth eating. Someone wondered aloud why France in particular had come to occupy the position of finest culinary tradition when Spain and Italy seemed, by most straightforward measures, to offer food that was equally beautiful and perhaps more generously given, and this question generated a small, wandering disagreement that moved pleasantly through several exchanges without arriving at any particular conclusion. The thread noted, with something approaching fond amusement, that French haute cuisine had developed a notable tradition of presenting very small amounts of food on very large white plates, and surrounding them with arrangements of sauce drawn with what appeared to be considerable artistic intentionality, and that there was something both genuinely impressive and faintly comic about this, a great tradition that had chosen to express itself through restraint and negative space rather than through abundance. But then someone raised the point that had perhaps been waiting quietly in the background of the whole conversation, that Britain had curry, and that this was not a small thing, not a footnote, but something closer to the heart of what the island had become. Not just curry as a borrowed import, unchanged and unchanged for, but a whole tradition of Anglo-Indian cooking that had grown up over generations, shaped by the long and complicated history between Britain and the Indian subcontinent, producing something that was neither purely Indian nor purely British, but something new and particular to that island and that specific history. The dish that had come to be known as chicken tikka masala, warm and slightly sweet, rich with cream and tomato, smelling of cumin and coriander and cardamom, was often described, with a kind of affectionate irony, as Britain's unofficial national dish, and this was perhaps more truth than irony, because it told a quiet story about what an island becomes through centuries of contact with the wider world. And it was also worth noting, someone added, that the curry powder found in Japanese kitchens, the mild, fragrant blend that flavored the beloved katsu curry eaten in homes and school cafeterias across Japan, had traveled there by way of Britain, carried by the British Navy in the 19th century, which meant that one of Japan's most comforting everyday meals carried, somewhere in its ancestry, an English postmark. London, mentioned toward the later part of the thread, had come to be considered one of the finest cities in the world for eating, not because of its own historical cuisine, but because of the layers of influence that had settled over it like geological strata across many decades, one culture's flavor beneath another's, and all of it available to anyone willing to turn a corner. The Chinese restaurants of Chinatown, the Indian restaurants of Brick Lane, the small Vietnamese cafes and the Turkish grills and the quiet Japanese ramen shops that had opened without ceremony and built their loyal followings one bowl at a time, the city had become something like a living library of the world's foods, a place where a single afternoon of slow walking could take a person through a dozen different histories of hunger and nourishment. This was, when considered carefully, perhaps the true and unlikely achievement of a country whose native cuisine had not always served it well, not a food tradition that had gone out and conquered, but a city that had made room, had opened itself, and had let the world cook quietly within its walls. The thread turned, in its quieter later pages, toward a comparison that had perhaps been implicit throughout the whole conversation, the question of how any culture looks at the foods of another culture, and what those looks reveal about the viewer as much as about the thing being viewed. Someone observed that gelid eels, described to a Japanese person who had never encountered them, would sound every bit as strange and particular as natto might sound to an English person who had never encountered that the fermented soybeans, sticky and pungent and trailing their long threads, their smell announcing itself from across the room before anything else had the chance. And there was something genuinely useful in this observation, a reminder that the foods we find unusual are usually foods that grew from a particular place and a particular need, from conditions of climate and soil and history that are not our own, and that seen from inside that history, they make a quiet and coherent kind of sense. Natto, after all, had been produced for centuries as a practical answer to a practical question: how to preserve protein through the cold months, how to keep something nutritious available when fresh ingredients were scarce, and had become, through generations of eating and familiarity and childhood breakfasts, a taste that some people loved and others politely set aside, and there was no particular wisdom in either response. The oats that appeared in haggis appeared also in porridge, that grey and humble morning bowl, cooked slowly in water or milk on the cooker before the day began, the kind of meal that made no particular promises but kept the one it made. It was, in its quiet and unassuming way, not so different from the okayu that a Japanese grandmother might prepare for someone unwell, the thin rice porridge, gentle and warm, without demands, the kind of food that simply offers what it has and asks nothing in return from the person receiving it. There seemed to be a family resemblance between all the plain foods of the world, the oatmeals and the rice porridges and the simple broths and the bread torn into warm water, foods made for cold mornings and tired bodies, and the times when what was needed was not a feast but simply something warm and sufficient and offered with some degree of care. The thread ended, as such threads tend to, not with a verdict but with a gentle trailing off, a few final observations, a note from someone who reflected that being able to eat at all was itself a kind of fortune not everyone shared equally. And then the words stopped coming and the thread grew quiet in the way of conversations that have said what they needed to say. What remained in the space after the conversation was not quite a conclusion about British food but something softer and perhaps more lasting, a recognition that food is always history, that every dish carries within it the story of the people who made it and the world that shaped them, and that even the plainest meal on the plainest plate has something to say if one approaches it with enough patience and enough goodwill. The full English breakfast, with its slightly overcooked sausages and its toast gone cold at the edges, was not attempting to be French cuisine, it was attempting to be itself, to fill and to warm, to carry the person eating it through whatever grey morning waited on the other side of the kitchen window. And in that modest and honest ambition, there was a dignity worth noticing, the same dignity that lives in the bowl of okayu set on a bedside table, in the onigiri wrapped in nori and pressed into someone's hands before a long journey, in all the foods that do not ask to be admired but simply offer what they have, without ceremony, without asking for anything back. Every country has a flavor that is its own and that takes some patience to understand from the outside, some willingness to approach without the assumption of strangeness already settled in the mind, and this was perhaps what the whole thread had been slowly circling around without quite finding the words for, that food is not a ranking but a long and ongoing conversation between a place and the people who call it home. The lamp in the study had burned low during all this thinking, and the tea in the cup had cooled to the temperature of the room, and the question of whether British food truly deserved its famous reputation seemed, from this quiet evening distance, a little less important than it had appeared at the beginning of the evening. What seemed to matter more was simply the warmth of the image, someone, somewhere on that grey northern island, standing in their kitchen in the early morning and listening to the kettle begin its slow and familiar whistle, finding in that small ritual the same uncomplicated comfort that people find in small rituals everywhere, in every kitchen, in every language, in every season. And so the thread rested, as conversations always rest eventually, and the night was soft around it, and somewhere on that island the mist was coming in gently from the water, and someone was sleeping peacefully, full enough, warm enough, which was perhaps all that any meal has ever truly been asked to accomplish. And so we leave that hallway behind, its shadows folding gently closed like the pages of an old book set aside for the night. There is no hurry now. If you need to shift, to settle deeper into your pillow, to let your shoulders release just a little more, this is exactly the moment for that. Take one slow breath in, and let it go without a thought. Our next story takes us to a quieter setting, a place where the pace is softer, the voice is unhurried, where even the silences hold something kind. We will arrive there together, gently, whenever you are ready. Somewhere in the long silence between one century and the next, The whole story of these islands settles into something slower and more weighted, like a letter that has been written and rewritten many times until the paper grows soft at the folds. When we last walked alongside England and Scotland, they had reached that careful arrangement, two separate nations, still distinct in their laws and their languages of pride, yet sharing a single crown, as though one king could hold two different hearts without ever having to choose between them. Such arrangements, however, are not still things. They lean, slowly and without announcement, in the direction of whoever holds the greater weight of money and soldiers and influence. Since 1603, when a Scottish king named James had travelled south to wear the English crown as well, the two nations had shared that single monarch holding, in theory, to a separate and careful peace. Somewhere in those 100 years of half-union, something was wearing thin, the pressure of debt and war and the slow weariness that settles into an arrangement that has never quite been resolved. In 1707, after years of negotiation and quiet argument and the kind of persuasion that sometimes looks, from a certain angle, very much like pressure, the Acts of Union were finally signed, and the Kingdom of Great Britain came officially into being. It was a new name for a new arrangement, though the bones of it had been forming for a long time before anyone set a pen to paper. For England, this was a consolidation, a tidying, a formal acknowledgement of what had already been quietly true for several decades. For Scotland, it was something harder to name, something resembling acceptance, the kind that comes when you have weighed all the alternatives and found each of them, in its own way, more difficult. The Scottish Parliament was dissolved, its members absorbed into the Parliament at Westminster, and the seat of power moved south, further south, to that great city on the Thames that Scotland had always watched with a complicated kind of regard. Some Scots mourned this openly, walking out of their Parliament chamber for the last time with a kind of grief that political events rarely seem to earn, and some accepted it quietly, and some found ways to hold both feelings at once, which is perhaps the most human response to an enormous change. And yet, and this is worth holding gently in mind, Scotland did not disappear. Its legal system remained distinct, shaped by different traditions than England's, and its church continued in its own form, and its hills and its coastlines and its particular way of greeting a stranger all remained entirely, stubbornly, beautifully Scottish. Identity, it seems, is not always lost when a parliament closes its doors. Now we turn west, across the water, toward the island that lies just off the left edge of Britain on any old map. Ireland, green and ancient and long accustomed to its own ways. The Irish people had been living there since long before the Romans came to Britain, and the Celts had settled among them, and the language and the music and the stories had grown deep roots in the soft western soil. Even when the Vikings arrived, those seafarers from the north who seemed in those centuries to find their way to every shore island absorbed them slowly, and the Vikings built ports and traded goods and eventually became, in the gentle way of things, simply Irish. What Ireland had not been, for most of its long history, was a direct concern of the English crown, not formally, not in the way that Wales and Scotland had been drawn into that orbit. That changed in 1541, when a king named Henry VIII decided that he would be King of Ireland as well, and had the Irish Parliament confirm this, whether or not the Irish Parliament was entirely of one mind on the matter. Henry is remembered as a man of enormous appetite and enormous will, capable of great warmth and great severity in the same long reign, a figure who bent the institutions around him to his purposes with a thoroughness that left the whole landscape of English faith and law rearranged. He had, some years earlier, broken with the Catholic Church in Rome and established his own Church of England, and this was not simply a religious matter but a political one of the first order, the kind of rupture that sends tremors through every relationship a kingdom holds with its neighbors. The break had begun, the stories tell, with something as personal as a marriage, a desire for divorce that Rome would not permit, and a king entirely unused to hearing the word no. Whatever the fullness of his reasons, the Church of England was now Protestant, and Henry's England would carry that distinction forward, and it would come, in time, to matter enormously in Ireland. Ireland, unlike the parts of Britain that had been resettled under English influence, remained deeply and devotedly Catholic, its faith woven into daily life the way the sound of the sea is woven into a coastal village, present and unremarkable and entirely essential. And so when England began to press its authority onto Ireland, there was already a deep division at the center of things, a difference not merely of politics and power but of something people carry in their bodies, in the way they pray and what they teach their children. In the northern part of Ireland, the province that would eventually become what is now called Northern Ireland, English and Scottish Protestant settlers were deliberately brought in, beginning in the early 1600s, a settling of people with different traditions onto land that had long had its own. This is the kind of change that takes generations to become a grievance, and then more generations still before anyone finds the language for what has actually happened, and longer still before any resolution can even be imagined. For a long time, Ireland remained its own kingdom in name, joined to Britain by that same crown-sharing arrangement that Scotland had once had, a union in title that was not quite a union in practice, held together by the thinnest of formal threads. Then, near the end of the 18th century, the world shifted. The American colonies had declared their independence, and across the narrow water France had turned itself entirely inside out in revolution, and the air everywhere seemed charged with the quiet possibility that things long endured might not have to be endured much longer. Ireland rose in 1798, not in a single voice but in many, Catholics and some Protestants together, worn down by years of laws that treated them as subjects of a lesser kind, inspired by those distant declarations of rights and freedoms. France sent ships to help, and for a brief season it seemed as though something was truly changing. But the rising was put down, slowly and then decisively, and the French ships turned back before they could land their soldiers, and the silence that followed was of the kind that falls after something enormous has been attempted and has not succeeded. The British government, shaken by how close things had come, decided that the half measure of a separate Irish Parliament was no longer workable, and in 1800, through the Act of Union, Ireland was formally joined to Great Britain. The kingdom's name changed once more, it became the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and Irish members of Parliament came to sit at Westminster, and the Parliament in Dublin closed its doors. Some in Ireland saw this as the beginning of something, a seat at a larger table. Many more saw it as the closing of a door that had been built for them, and they did not feel they had chosen to close it. For the Catholics of Ireland in particular, who had hoped that union might bring relief from the many laws that had long restricted their full participation in public life, the years that followed were long and, often, deeply disappointing. Time moved, as it always does, in its patient and unhurried way, and Ireland endured and changed and endured again through the long and terrible famine of the 1840s, through the great emigration that followed it, through the slow reawakening of national feeling in the decades after, until something new began, at last, to stir. In 1918, after a war that had taken Irish lives alongside English and Scottish and Welsh lives in the fields of France and Belgium, a different kind of declaration was made in Dublin. Irish representatives, gathering in a chamber warmed by winter light, declared an Irish Republic and took up the slow and difficult work of making that declaration real against the resistance of a government that had not recognized it. The conflict that followed lasted from 1919 into the early 1920s, and it was the kind of fighting that leaves marks in the memory of a place that do not simply fade when the fighting stops. What emerged in 1921 was a treaty, a negotiated settlement, imperfect in the way that all negotiated settlements tend to be, satisfying no one entirely but making possible, at least, the beginning of something new. The southern 26 counties of Ireland would become the Irish Free State, self-governing, a dominion, not quite fully independent but no longer simply subject, finding its way slowly toward the sovereignty it had long carried in its imagination. The 6 northern counties, where Protestant settlers had long formed a majority, would remain within the United Kingdom, a decision shaped not by every voice on that land but by the weight of that particular history and that particular settlement. And so the kingdom's name changed once more, settling into what it remains today, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Ireland itself continued on its long road, adopting a new constitution in 1937 and leaving the Commonwealth entirely in 1949, becoming simply Ireland, a name that was itself a kind of arrival, a final step in a journey that had taken centuries. What remained across the border in the north was something more layered, 2 communities sharing the same land, each carrying its own memory of the same history, each with its own account of what the land meant and who it had belonged to and for how long. There would be further difficulty and further sadness in the decades that followed, before something resembling peace was carefully arrived at, and even that peace required, and still requires, tending, the way any living thing does. When you step back from all of this and let the whole long shape of it come quietly into view, what you see is something worth sitting with for a moment, 4 nations sharing a small cluster of islands, each still distinct, each still proud, each still carrying its own story. England remains the largest and the most economically powerful, and this has never entirely stopped being a source of quiet friction with its neighbors, the way any imbalance in a shared arrangement makes itself felt, sooner or later, in the texture of daily life. But Scotland has its own parliament again now, restored in 1999 after nearly 3 centuries, and Wales has its own assembly, and Northern Ireland has its own assembly too, and each of these bodies handles many of the decisions that matter most to the people who live in those places. And on the rugby pitch and on the football field, the 4 nations send out separate teams, each wearing its own colors and singing something different when the music begins, which is, perhaps, one of the clearest signs that something real and living remains beneath all the formal arrangements. Someone observing from the outside, from Japan, say, where the 4 nations might at first seem like regions in the way that Kanto and Kansai are regions, a matter of local pride and regional character, might be puzzled by the depth of the feeling. But from the inside, the difference feels more like being told that Japan and Korea and China should simply be considered one nation, which would seem, to anyone who understood the depth of those distinct and deeply lived histories, not just unusual but genuinely, profoundly wrong. The point is not bitterness, it is simply the weight of a separate story, a story carried in a particular language, in the shape of particular hills, in the name of a place your grandmother described on winter evenings. Identity, like water moving slowly through stone, finds its own level over enough time, and no act of parliament and no formal union of crowns can quite dissolve what a people have built together across centuries of living and mourning and singing and remembering. The United Kingdom holds its 4 nations in a union that is real, shared in its military and its currency and its long history of influence in the wider world, and also still unfinished, as most human arrangements are unfinished, still being quietly negotiated, generation by generation. Perhaps that is not so different from any household you have known, different people under one roof, each with their habits and their grievances and their quiet particular pride, finding, most days, a way to pass the evening in something resembling peace. The borders on the map are old now, and the names are familiar, and the arguments, though they continue, have taken on the texture of something lived with rather than something that must urgently be resolved before morning. England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, 4 names, 4 stories, 1 small constellation of islands, and enough history between them to fill many long and quiet nights. Tonight, let them rest. Let the green hills of Wales lie quietly in the dark, the mountain ranges moving through them from north to south like a long, slow breath held gently in sleep. Let the lochs of Scotland hold the night sky in their still surfaces, dark and patient and as old as anything on these islands. Let the coastline of Northern Ireland listen to whatever the sea has to say in the small hours, as it has been listening since long before any of us learned the names of these places. And let England sleep, as it has slept through so many centuries, the old cities and the fields and the slow rivers, all resting now, under skies that have seen more than any of us can hold in memory. The story of how 4 very different peoples come to share a single name is never a clean story. It is full of moments where the wrong choice was made, and moments where the right choice came far too late, and long stretches where no one was choosing at all, only enduring. And yet what endures, on the other side of all of that, is something worth noticing: 4 distinct peoples, still distinct, still proud of what makes them unlike each other, still carrying their own names forward into whatever comes next. In that persistence, in that quiet survival of identity across centuries of pressure and change, there is something remarkable, something that might, if the night is still enough, feel almost like peace. And that, perhaps, is where the chapter rests for tonight, in the gentle knowledge that the map has been drawn and redrawn many times, and the names have changed and changed again, and something in each of the 4 peoples has remained, warm and intact, through all of it. Let that thought settle slowly, the way the last light settles from a window at the end of a long day, and let the story wait where stories always wait, patient and still, in the silence, until morning. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet echoes fading like a breath released into still air. There is no hurry now. If you need a moment, take it, let your shoulders soften, let the weight of the day press a little deeper into the mattress beneath you. The night is unhurried, and so are we. Draw one slow breath in, and let it go. Our next story takes us to a quieter setting, a small apartment at the edge of a city, where the streets have already gone to sleep and only the faintest glow of a distant street lamp reaches the window. We will arrive there gently, together, whenever you are ready. Somewhere in the long hours after midnight, when the mind loosens its hold on the things it has been carrying all day, there is a particular quiet that comes from remembering that the world has always been complicated, and that nations, like people, carry their histories in ways they do not always choose. Settle a little more deeply now, and let the voice of this chapter move through you slowly, the way a hand moves across an old map, tracing the lines without urgency. What we are moving toward tonight is a set of stories drawn from the long history of a nation that called itself, in its official name, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, a name so long that schoolchildren in Japan, it is said, would sometimes read it aloud in class and laugh with disbelief at the syllables. We will not be judging this nation tonight, nor its people, nor the men and women who made the decisions we are about to hear. We will simply listen, the way one listens to an old story told by someone who has had many years to make peace with its complications. History is heavy sometimes, but it can also be held lightly, especially in the soft quiet of a night like this one. The first story begins at a time when Britain and China, the China of the Qing dynasty, presided over by emperors in silk robes in the Forbidden City, had been trading with one another for many decades, and the trade had grown to be very large and very important, and also, from Britain's perspective, very unbalanced. The reason for the imbalance was tea, a simple thing, really, the dried leaves of a particular plant, brewed in hot water, poured into cups and passed around in the mornings of 100,000 English households from Liverpool to London, from fishermen's cottages to parlours lined with good furniture. Britain was buying enormous quantities of this tea from China, and silk, and porcelain, and the silver was flowing steadily eastward with every trade, filling the holds of ships bound for Chinese ports. China, for its part, had less interest in what Britain was selling. British clockwork and manufactured goods found only limited buyers in a civilization that had, for many centuries, considered itself to be the center of the world's refinements. The merchants and ministers of Britain watched the silver leave and wondered what could be done, and what they arrived at was a solution that has not grown more admirable with the passage of time. They began, through intermediaries and along routes that were technically illegal even by their own laws, to bring a substance called opium into the ports of China, a narcotic grown in the fields of British-controlled India, traded quietly, moving deeper into the towns and provinces of the Qing Empire with each passing year. Opium is a powerful and destructive substance, and the people who introduced it to China knew this, or could have known it, and it spread with a particular kind of relentlessness through a population that had no prepared defense against it. For a time, corrupt officials in the Chinese ports accepted payments to look the other way, and the trade continued, growing larger, and the silver that had been flowing from Britain to China began, slowly, to reverse its direction. But eventually a commissioner named Lin Zexu arrived on the southern coast with a different disposition. Lin Zexu was a man of serious convictions, who declined the payments offered to him and asked instead that the contraband be surrendered. When it was not surrendered voluntarily, he arranged to have it confiscated, over 1,400 tons of it, a quantity that required 23 days to dissolve in lime and salt water at the edge of the sea, the slow labor of dissolution under a coastal sky. What followed was the kind of escalation that happens when pride meets calculation. British merchants and diplomats protested the confiscation, and incidents multiplied, and back in London a minister named Palmerston was making the case for something stronger. The British Navy arrived in the summer of 1840, and the war that followed lasted 2 years, and was decided by the considerable difference in military technology between a nation that had passed through its industrial revolution and one that had not yet done so. One by one, China's coastal ports were taken, and its inland rivers were entered, and by 1842 the Qing government had agreed to a treaty signed in the city of Nanjing, a treaty that included reparations, and the ceding of a rocky island called Hong Kong, and the loss of certain rights that a sovereign nation would normally hold for itself. The name of that agreement, the Treaty of Nanjing, appears in history textbooks in many countries, and it is one of those documents that is returned to again and again by people trying to understand how the modern world came to be shaped as it is. There were, careful historians have noted, decisions made on both sides of this conflict that were ill-judged, and the full story is not a simple one of innocence meeting aggression, and yet something about it lingers, a disquiet that the years do not entirely dissolve. The listener resting quietly tonight need not resolve that disquiet, need not arrive at any final judgment. History rarely offers final judgments, and the long night is not the place to seek them. Let that story rest for a moment, and let the next one move in more gently. This second story is smaller in scale, more intimate, and it unfolded on an October evening in 1886, in the dark waters off the coast of Japan, near a prefecture called Wakayama where the coastline folds into quiet bays. A British cargo ship called the Normanton had departed from Yokohama and was making her way along the coast toward Kobe, carrying freight and 15 Japanese passengers, when a storm came in from the open water and the ship began to founder. The storm was serious, and in the hours that followed, the 26 British and German crew members made their way to the lifeboats and were carried safely away from the sinking vessel. All 26 of them survived. The 15 Japanese passengers did not. The news reached Tokyo by telegraph, and the foreign ministry official who received it, a man named Inoue Keiru, read the message and then sat very still, it can be imagined, in whatever quiet room he occupied. The question that arose naturally, and that many people in Japan came to share when the news became widely known, was a straightforward one. How, in a single sinking ship, could every member of the crew reach safety and not one passenger survive? An inquiry was sought, but Japan at that time was constrained by treaty arrangements that severely limited its ability to investigate such matters. Unequal treaties signed under foreign pressure in earlier decades, granting citizens of certain nations a legal immunity from Japanese courts on Japanese soil. Captain Drake of the Normanton was tried in a consular court, one that operated according to different rules, and he offered the explanation that the Japanese passengers had not understood English, that they had remained below decks when his crew had urged them toward the boats, that a cargo vessel carried no Japanese-speaking staff. The court accepted this explanation, and the captain was acquitted, and the verdict settled into public consciousness like a stone dropped into still water, spreading rings that moved outward for years. The newspapers of Tokyo wrote about the outcome with the restrained sorrow of people who know they are right but have limited recourse. One editorial observed that no person in a sinking ship, watching sailors gesture urgently toward lifeboats, would be so incapable of understanding that they would simply remain and wait for the sea to rise around them. It was a reasonable observation, held gently but firmly, and what it did over the years that followed was give shape to a conviction that had already been growing in Japan, that the system of extraterritoriality, by which foreign nationals were exempt from Japanese law on Japanese soil, could not continue. 8 years after the Normanton sank, Japan succeeded in negotiating the end of consular jurisdiction with Britain, and the legal standing of foreign nationals came into line with what fairness would suggest it ought to have been. 16 years after the Normanton, not very long, in the life of nations, Japan and Britain signed an alliance with one another, the Anglo-Japanese Alliance, which held for 20 years across the shifting currents of the Pacific. This turn of events has always seemed quietly remarkable to thoughtful readers of history, that grievance and alliance can coexist, that nations can carry the memory of what went wrong between them and still find reasons, and perhaps even reasons rooted in mutual respect, to work alongside one another. The Normanton rests somewhere on the ocean floor now, and the names of the 15 passengers are not as widely remembered as perhaps they deserve to be, but the moment they were part of left a mark on Japanese legal history that is real and that lasted. And now the third and final story of this chapter, the most tangled of the three, and the one whose threads reach furthest into the present. This one begins during the First World War, in the years when the European powers were exhausting themselves and one another in a conflict that had grown far larger and far more terrible than almost anyone had anticipated at its beginning. Britain was fighting on many fronts and needed allies in many regions, and the Middle East was one of those regions, held then by the Ottoman Empire, which had entered the war on the opposing side. In order to destabilize the Ottoman position from within, Britain approached the Arab leaders of the region, and specifically a man named Hussein, who was the Sharif of Mecca and held considerable religious and political authority across a wide part of the Arabian Peninsula. Through a correspondence with a British official named McMahon, Britain offered the Arab leaders something they had long wanted: support for Arab independence, the promise of a homeland, a nation of their own in the territories they inhabited, in exchange for organizing a revolt against the Ottomans from within. The Arab leaders received these letters with something that must have felt, in that moment, like genuine hope. Here, written in official correspondence from a powerful nation, was a commitment to their future. They organized the revolt, and it became one of the more dramatic campaigns of the war, a desert uprising that spread through the peninsula and weakened the Ottoman position from south and east. At the same time, and this is where the story becomes harder to follow, as it was harder to follow for the people most directly inside it, at the same time, British and French diplomats were meeting elsewhere to make quite different arrangements. A British official named Sykes and a French diplomat named Picot had been drafting a plan for what would happen to the Ottoman territories after the war ended, and their plan involved dividing those territories between Britain and France and Russia, with Palestine designated as a zone of international administration rather than as part of any Arab homeland. This arrangement was kept as a secret, held in sealed archives, not shared with the people whose futures it described, and it contradicted the Hussein-McMahon correspondence in ways that became, once examined on a map, unmistakable. The secret did not hold. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, the new government opened the archives and published what it found, and the contradiction between the two sets of promises was laid out in the open, plain to anyone who wished to read it. And there was still a third promise, made separately, in a letter written by a British Foreign Secretary named Arthur Balfour to a prominent member of the Rothschild family, expressing Britain's support for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The Zionist movement, the organized aspiration to establish a Jewish national home in the land that Jewish tradition had carried through centuries of dispersal, had been growing in strength, and British support for it carried weight both symbolically and in the practical landscape of wartime diplomacy. The reasons for the Balfour Declaration included genuine sympathy for the Jewish people and their long historical connection to that land, and also, historians have carefully noted, the practical wartime calculation of securing goodwill from Jewish communities whose support mattered in Britain and America. When the three sets of promises are laid side by side, Arab independence, European partition, Jewish homeland, all bearing on the same small, ancient, inhabited piece of ground, the contradictions are plain enough, and they were plain at the time to anyone who read all three documents together. Britain has argued, across the many decades since, that the documents admit of interpretations that are not wholly irreconcilable, that boundaries were imprecise, that the word homeland fell short of an outright promise of statehood, that certain territories were technically outside the scope of certain agreements. These arguments have been made carefully, and disputed carefully, and the reading one arrives at tends to depend on what one brings to the text. What settled across the Middle East in the years after the First World War was a new arrangement of borders and authorities drawn up by the victorious powers and imposed on lands where other people had long been living, and in the decades that followed, the promises that had been made came into collision with one another in ways that unfolded across the whole of the 20th century. The people most affected by these collisions were, for the most part, people whose ancestors had written none of those letters and attended none of those diplomatic meetings, people who found themselves living in a place that powerful men elsewhere had decided to argue over in candlelit rooms. This is one of the more melancholy patterns in the history of empires, that the consequences of decisions made far from a place fall most heavily on the people who were never consulted about them. And yet, here in the quiet, something else can be held alongside that melancholy. The world has not stopped working toward a resolution of what was left unresolved, imperfectly, and too slowly, and with many reversals and many moments of despair, but working nonetheless, and the people most directly affected have shown, generation after generation, a resilience and a creativity and a desire for ordinary life that no amount of historical entanglement has been able to extinguish entirely. That is worth holding close, especially in the long hours before morning, when the difficult things can be met with a little more room around them than the bright daytime usually allows. 3 stories, then, from the long archive of a complicated history, 3 moments when something bent in the wrong direction and left a mark that the years have had to slowly work around. There is a quality to late-night thinking that allows history to be received differently than it can be in the brightness of the day, not more shallowly, but more gently, the way old photographs can be looked at in lamplight without the pressure to assign blame to every face in them. The names carry their weight and their meaning, and they are worth knowing. Lin Zexu standing at the southern Chinese coast through 23 days of careful dissolution, the Normanton turning in its autumn storm off the Wakayama shore, the careful penmanship of diplomatic letters folded and sealed with wax and sent across great distances to men who would read them in the light of other interests. And all of it, now, is still the decisions made, the documents signed, the people who made them long returned to the quiet from which all people come. The night is quiet around you, and the warmth of where you are resting is complete, and nothing that was decided in the 1840s or the 1880s or the years of the First World War requires your attention in this particular moment. History is patient, it does not go anywhere. It waits with the particular patience of things that have already happened, and it will be there in the morning, as it always is, ready to be read a little more fully and understood a little more completely. For now, let the breath slow, and let the weight of 3 promises made in the offices of empires, in the cabins of ships, in the careful correspondence of men who believed they were managing the world wisely, settle into the larger stillness that holds everything in the end. And perhaps that is where this chapter rests for tonight, not with a verdict, not with a resolution, but with the quiet understanding that even the most complicated histories are made of human moments, as tender and as fallible as any other, and that the thread of goodwill, however thin it sometimes runs, has never entirely broken. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting its shadows dissolve quietly into the dark behind us, like a breath finally released after being held too long. There is no hurry now. If you need to rest here for a moment, between one story and the next, please do let your shoulders sink a little deeper, let your hands grow heavy and still. The night holds plenty of room for pausing. Our next story takes us to a quieter setting, a place where the air moves slowly and voices are gentle, where nothing asks very much of you at all. Simply follow the sound of this voice, whenever you are ready, at whatever pace feels soft enough. Somewhere along the grey, salt-washed coast of an island in the North Atlantic, there is a kitchen or the memory of one where a pot of something sits on a low flame, and the steam rises without any particular hurry into the cool afternoon air. We have arrived, in this chapter, at the story of British food, which is perhaps less a single story and more a long, winding conversation that cultures have been having with one another for several centuries now. It is a mild subject, in the end, even if the people who discuss it sometimes use language that sounds rather less than mild. The notion that British cooking occupies a particular place low on the list, one might say, of the world's culinary traditions has circulated for decades, carried from country to country in the luggage of travelers and in the lightly amused tones of dinner party conversation. And yet the story of why British food developed the way it did is actually rather interesting. The way most stories about how things came to be are interesting, when you follow them back far enough to their roots. We should begin, as the discussion often does, with something uncomplicated, a piece of battered fish, golden at the edges, resting beside a heap of thick-cut potatoes fried in oil until they are soft within and quietly crisp without. Fish and chips, the dish is called, and it is recognizable to almost anyone who has spent any time thinking about British culture, a dish so tied to the national image that it appears in novels and films and tourist descriptions with the same reliability as a red telephone box or a grey October morning. It arrived in England in the 19th century, carried in part by Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe who had long traditions of frying fish in batter, and it spread through the country with the momentum of something that working people needed, that they could afford, and carry home wrapped in old newspaper, and eat in the warmth of the evening. What is less often mentioned, and what becomes interesting when you sit with it, is that the fish arrives at the fryer without what a Japanese cook, or a cook from almost anywhere along the Mediterranean, would consider essential preparation. In Japan, a piece of fish destined for the pan would first be touched with salt, rested briefly, perhaps treated with a little sake or a gentle marinade to coax out freshness and soften any lingering sea smell, because the preparation of the ingredient is understood as inseparable from the meal itself. In England, the tradition moved differently, and the fish arrives plain, and the seasoning, if there is to be any, is left entirely to the person eating it, who reaches across the table for the salt shaker or tips the malt vinegar that stands in its bottle near the pepper. There is a philosophy in this, one might almost say, a particular relationship to eating that treats flavor as a personal matter, something the diner adds rather than something the cook provides, and that philosophy, however foreign it may seem, is genuinely held. A traditional fish and chips supper is served with salt and vinegar on the table, and the understanding is that each person will season their own portion according to their own preference, and this is not carelessness so much as a different kind of hospitality, an offer of materials rather than a finished statement. Whether it produces the most satisfying result is another question, and the answer, by most accounts, is that it does not, quite, though the dish itself is not without its pleasures, the crunch of the batter, the warmth of the potato, the particular comfort of something simple eaten at the end of a long day. And speaking of long days and cold evenings, the weather enters this story in ways that go considerably deeper than mere inconvenience. Britain sits far enough north, and under a sky that carries enough moisture in from the Atlantic, that the growing of vegetables and fruits has always been a somewhat uncertain enterprise. The long southern light that ripens a tomato in Tuscany, or brings sweetness to a peach along the Spanish coast, is a light that Britain receives only in occasional, grateful bursts. The result, across many centuries, was that fresh produce was genuinely scarce in winter, that what arrived in markets was often already past its best, and that generations of cooks learned under these conditions to apply heat with great thoroughness, to boil the cabbage until nothing uncertain remained within it, to stew the meat until it yielded completely, because heat was understood as both nourishment and protection. This was not carelessness so much as a reasonable response to genuine difficulty, and it left its mark on a culinary tradition that came to associate prolonged cooking with reliability, with safety, with the knowledge that whatever was being served had been thoroughly attended to. Even when better produce became available, when ships could carry lemons from the south, when railways brought fresh vegetables from the countryside into the cities, the old habit persisted, because habits embedded in kitchens over many generations are not easily set aside. A vegetable that has been overcooked for 150 years will continue to be overcooked in the next generation, not out of stubbornness exactly, but because that is what the kitchen knows, and what the kitchen teaches without knowing it is teaching. There is another layer to this story, one that involves the great upheaval that came over Britain beginning in the latter half of the 18th century and rolling forward through the 19th, the Industrial Revolution, that vast reorganization of life and labor and place that altered the landscape of an entire country within the span of a few generations. Before those decades of transformation, most of the people in Britain lived in the countryside, in villages and small towns where local food traditions had accumulated slowly over centuries, where a particular way of preparing a winter broth or a smoked fish had passed from one generation to the next without being written down. Because it did not need to be written down, it was carried in hands and in memory, in the rhythms of seasonal kitchens. The Industrial Revolution changed where people lived with a speed that history had rarely seen. Factories drew workers from the countryside into the cities, and within a few decades the proportions of the population reversed, and what had been a country of rural people became largely a country of city people, and the old recipes did not always make the journey. Young people arrived in the cities to work long hours in mills and foundries, and they were tired in the evenings, and the kind of cooking that requires patience and accumulated knowledge and the careful passing down of specific technique is not easily maintained under such conditions. in such exhaustion. The cities themselves were unprepared for so many people arriving so rapidly, the water systems and the drains were overwhelmed, and illnesses moved through the crowded districts with a quiet persistence that made people wary, again, of anything that had not been thoroughly cooked, thoroughly boiled, thoroughly made safe by fire. And so the heat was applied in abundance, and the tradition of thorough cooking became still more deeply rooted, not from indifference to flavor but from something closer to fear, a reasonable fear, in the circumstances, a fear that anyone living in those streets at that time would have shared. It is worth resting with that for a moment, the idea that what sometimes reads now as a lack of culinary ambition was, in its historical moment, a form of care, a way of protecting people who had very little protection available to them. The overcooking that seems puzzling when viewed from outside had reasons, and those reasons were once matters of real health in the densely packed streets of Victorian London, where disease was not an abstraction but a neighbor. This does not mean the food tasted better for it, it very likely tasted quite plain, but it gives the history a texture worth noticing, a sadness underneath the comedy that other cultures sometimes make of British eating habits. And there are other dishes, beyond fish and chips, that any serious conversation about British food tends to linger over with a kind of bemused affection, or at least a kind of perplexed curiosity. There is Marmite, for instance, a very dark paste, dense and deeply savory, made from the yeast left over from the brewing of beer, which is spread on buttered toast in the mornings by a population that grew up with its salt intensity and considers it as unremarkable as any other morning ritual. It is the kind of food that functions less as flavor and more as a relationship. You either grew up with it and find it comforting in the way that miso soup is comforting to those who grew up with miso soup, or you encounter it as an adult and find yourself wondering, quietly, what you are meant to do with something so forceful. There is something rather Japanese about Marmite. In a way, what it delivers is a deep, fermented savoriness that resembles umami, that quality that Japanese cooks have cultivated and refined over centuries in their dashi and their aged soy sauce, though Marmite delivers it in a form that is rather more blunt, rather less refined, without the gentleness that Japanese umami typically carries. It is, perhaps, what umami might have become if it had developed on a grey northern island rather than in a culture that spent centuries paying very close attention to the way ingredients speak to one another. Then there is the stargazy pie, which carries in its name and its appearance something between a fishing village folktale and a child's illustration, a pastry crust from which whole fish emerge, their heads breaking the surface as though looking upward toward whatever sky might be visible, which is precisely what the name describes. It comes from Cornwall, from a coastal village where the story holds that a fisherman once returned from a difficult winter sea with enough catch to relieve his neighbors from hunger, and the pie was made to celebrate that return, and the fish heads were left visible so that everyone could see that the pie contained real fish, honest and whole, no trickery. Viewed in that light, the dish is not strange at all, it is a memorial to relief, to the end of scarcity, to the sight of a boat coming through the grey water when everyone had begun to wonder privately whether it would come at all. What we sometimes read as eccentricity in old foods often has this character, a logic that made complete sense in its moment and that only becomes puzzling when the moment itself is forgotten, when the hunger that surrounded it has been replaced by sufficiency. There are gelid eels, too, which belong to a particular corner of London's working-class history, sold from market stalls in the East End for generations, cheap and filling and made from eels that were once plentiful in the Thames when the Thames still ran clean enough to support them. The eels were cut into pieces and simmered gently with vinegar and herbs and perhaps a little lemon, and then cooled, and as they cooled the natural collagen dissolved out of the fish and set around the pieces into a soft, savory jelly that required no additional ingredient to hold its shape. The fish provided everything the dish needed. It is a food of complete efficiency, of using everything available and wasting nothing, and it was eaten on cold market days by people who needed something warming and nourishing and could find it for very little money, and that, too, is a form of culinary intelligence, even if it does not produce a result that every palate would recognize as pleasurable. And there is haggis, which belongs more precisely to Scotland than to England, though it appears in any serious conversation about the food of these islands, sheep's offal mixed with oats and onion and spice and then cooked inside the stomach of the same animal, so that the casing itself becomes part of the dish. It sounds confronting, but almost every food culture in the world has some version of this kind of cooking, the use of the whole animal, the transformation of the parts that seem least promising into something that sustains and warms, and haggis, eaten in the right season with the right company, is understood by those who grew up with it as something genuinely comforting, something that belongs to particular evenings and particular celebrations. The question of whether these dishes are delicious is perhaps less interesting, in the end, than what they reveal about the weather, about the history, about the relationship that a culture developed with its food across many centuries of scarcity and change and making do. And then there is the third thread of this story, the one that is less about weather or upheaval and more about something that British people themselves sometimes acknowledge with a kind of rueful self-awareness, that food, as a subject of serious cultural attention, did not occupy in British life the same place it occupied elsewhere. In France, the pleasure of a meal is a cultural institution, debated and protected with the same seriousness given to music or architecture, and something similar is true in Italy, and in Spain, and in Japan, where cooking accumulated over centuries into something that people were proud of and deliberately maintained and passed along with care. In England, that particular form of seriousness around food developed more slowly, and in its absence there grew a kind of easy acceptance that if you wanted something elaborate and delicious, you might simply choose the Indian restaurant, or the Chinese one, or the Italian place on the corner, all of which were available in great abundance as the country drew people and cuisines from across the world it had connected to itself. Britain is, after all, a country that welcomed more cuisines from more parts of the world than almost any other, and the sheer variety of what can be eaten in London is extraordinary. Perhaps this abundance reduced the urgency to develop a strong native culinary tradition, in the same way that a river does not learn to carry water differently when the rain falls constantly. There is something rather touching about this, actually, when you hold it gently, a country that absorbed so much of the world into itself and found, in return, that the world's tables had arrived at its own door. And it is worth noting, quietly, that the reputation has never been entirely fair, and that fairness in these matters tends to arrive slowly, the way most fairness does. British cheese is extraordinary in its range and its depth, dozens of varieties, from the sharp crumble of a well-aged cheddar to the blue-veined softness of a good Stilton, and these are foods that require patience and skill and time, which are not the qualities one associates with indifference. British lamb has a quality that chefs from elsewhere have quietly admired for its particular sweetness, raised on hillside grasses in cool, wet air, the roast beef and roasted potatoes that anchor a Sunday lunch in an English household, done with care, are as satisfying as anything on a Northern European table. And the biscuits, perhaps this is a small thing to mention, at this hour of the evening, when you are already moving away from wakefulness, but the biscuits deserve a word, the shortbreads and digestives and ginger snaps and custard creams, all those flat, quietly sweet things that are eaten beside a cup of tea and that carry their own particular comfort, the comfort of the small and the familiar. The tea itself, of course, which is perhaps the most serious culinary achievement of the whole tradition, the specific ritual of it, the milk added in a particular order, the pot warmed first, the minutes counted, the cup that arrives as a form of care as much as a drink, the act of making it for someone as a way of saying that you noticed they needed something. In recent decades, the broader reputation has shifted, slowly and without announcement, as it tends to when a culture begins to take something seriously that it had previously been content to leave underdeveloped. Young British chefs began to travel more, to eat in other countries and return home with ideas, to think carefully about what Britain actually produces and what could genuinely be done with it, and they found that they had more to work with than the reputation had suggested. The grey light and the cool temperatures that once made fresh vegetables scarce turned out to produce lamb and beef of unusual quality, and root vegetables with a depth of flavour that warmer climates cannot replicate, and seafood from cold northern waters that has a sweetness and a firmness that is its own kind of excellence. The culinary tradition that had been interrupted by industrialization and poverty and the urgent necessity of simply feeding people found, in time, that it had more continuity than it realized in the farmhouse kitchens that never entirely stopped, in the village bakers, in the old recipes that had been written down after all, somewhere, in somebody's grandmother's hand. And so the story arrives, as most stories do, at something more complicated and more forgiving than it first appeared. The reputation for plain food is not entirely undeserved, but it is also not the whole truth, and the history behind it, the wet winters, the factories that emptied the villages, the generations of making do, is one that asks for understanding more than it asks for judgment. Most of what we call a culinary tradition is really a record of what people had available, and what they could afford, and what they learned to do under the particular conditions of their particular time. A cook seasoning fish with care and attention was drawing on centuries of accumulated knowledge and a culture that placed great value on that kind of attention, and was also working with ingredients that rewarded that attention in ways that a cod pulled from cold grey winter waters in a Victorian city might not have done. We bring to our tables what our histories have given us to work with, and the table is shaped by the land and the weather and the century as much as by any individual choice. There is something gentle in that understanding, the way it allows us to look at any food tradition, however plain or unfamiliar it might seem from the outside, and find within it the shape of real lives, of real constraints, of people doing their honest best with what the season and the ground provided. If you were to travel to Britain now and sit in a quiet pub somewhere in the countryside, in the early evening when the light comes low through the windows and the fire has been going long enough to warm the room completely, you might find food on the menu that would not embarrass any table in Europe. The pie might be made with local meat, the bread baked that morning, the cheese from a farm a few miles distant, and the whole thing held together by the particular satisfaction of eating something that belongs to its place, that grew in a specific soil, under a specific sky, and arrived at the table without pretending to be anything other than itself. And if the fish and chips that come wrapped in paper at the end of the evening still arrive without seasoning, if the malt vinegar sits in its bottle waiting for your own hand to tip it, that too is part of the tradition, that old and stubborn insistence that flavor is a personal matter, between the eater and the plate. There is something rather restful in that philosophy, actually, when you are this far into the evening, when the day is long behind you and the room is warm and nothing more needs to be decided tonight. The idea that not everything needs to be finished before it reaches you, that some things are left open, waiting for whatever you bring to them, asking only for your own quiet participation. Perhaps that is where the story of British food rests for tonight, not fully resolved, not entirely rehabilitated, but understood a little more gently than before, held with the kind of patient curiosity that asks nothing more of a thing than to be itself, honestly, in its own particular way. The rain falls on the Channel coast, as it so often does, and the lights in the small town below are beginning to go out, one by one, as the evening settles into proper darkness. The smell of salt water moves through the air toward wherever the houses are that still have their windows open a little, toward the rooms where people are reading the last page, or setting down a cup, or simply lying still and listening to the quiet. And somewhere in one of those houses, someone has put the kettle on, because it is that hour, and the water will come to its slow boil, and the tea will be made and carried carefully to whoever is waiting, and that, for tonight, is where we leave it, warm and unhurried and enough. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet secrets settling gently into the dark, like dust returning to rest on old wood. There is no hurry now. If you need a moment, take one, let your breath come slow and easy. Let your shoulders soften against whatever is holding you. The night is long and patient, and so are we. Our next story takes us to a quieter setting, somewhere the air sits still and the world outside has grown very far away. Just allow your eyes to remain closed, your thoughts to drift wherever they wish. We will find our way there together, unhurried, one soft word at a time. Japan had produced, in the fruit sando, a food that existed comfortably between categories, a sandwich and a sweet thing and neither one entirely, and this quality, this ease with being more than one thing at once, was perhaps part of what allowed it to travel as gently as it did. Others in the conversation noted that the reception of the fruit sando in London said something gentle about people's willingness to reach toward the unfamiliar when it is offered simply, without ceremony or explanation, and to find that it pleases them in the direct way that good food always has. The British had a long habit of adopting foods from other kitchens, making them part of the ordinary day, and people remarked that the curry and the noodle dish and the rice bowl borrowed from distant shores had all become, in time, simply what London ate on a Tuesday, and the fruit sando seemed to be joining that quiet, unhurried lineage. There was something reassuring in this pattern, the way good things moved across borders without needing to announce themselves, finding their welcome through taste alone, asking only to be tried, and it seemed like one of the gentler qualities the world possessed, an argument for something without the need to make it aloud. The bread remained a gentle point of discussion, the shokupan of the Japanese original, with its milk-soft texture and slight inherent sweetness, was not easily reproduced with standard white bread, and those who had known the original felt the difference and mentioned it in the fond way one mentions a small shortcoming in a place one has come to love anyway. But the essential character of the idea had crossed the sea intact, cream and strawberry and softness held between bread, eaten without ceremony, requiring only the appetite of the moment and both hands, and in that intact arrival there was something to feel quietly pleased about, a small evidence of things surviving their distances. The willingness of an idea to survive its crossing, to arrive somewhere new and still be recognizably itself, is not something that can be arranged in advance. It happens or it does not, and when it does, there is something worth noticing in it, something that deserves at least a moment of quiet acknowledgement. The conversation eventually settled, as conversations about food and law and crossing cultures tend to settle when they have been turned over enough times, into something quieter than where it began, a place where the specific question of taxation had given way to the softer and more interesting question of what was simply good. Somewhere a person in London had stood in a queue before the morning had properly arrived, and had held a cold sweet thing in both hands on a pavement while the city assembled itself around them, and the taste had been, in that moment, a small complete good thing in an ordinary life. Somewhere in Japan, in the bright interior of a convenience store, a fruit sando rested in its clear wrapper, showing its cross-section to anyone who paused to look, and a train arrived on the platform outside, and someone reached for the sandwich without particular thought and ate it on the way to wherever the day was taking them. These two people, the one in London in the early morning, the one in Japan on the platform, were connected by an idea that had passed between them without requiring introduction, carried by nothing more than taste and curiosity and the simple willingness to reach for something sweet when it is offered and the moment feels right. The legal question would find its answer in time, in the methodical way that legal questions do, and the sandwich would continue to be made and eaten regardless, because that is what happens with the things that find their people and are recognized by them. There is something restful in this, in the thought that food moves through the world on its own terms, that distances which seem significant on a map become nothing at all when someone takes a bite of something and simply, quietly finds it good, without needing to know how far it has come. The argument about whether it was a sandwich or a dessert, taxable or exempt, Japanese or British, had always been less interesting than the thing itself, the pale bread, the cold cream, the strawberry red and slightly tart in the way that strawberries are when they are exactly as they should be. And perhaps what the fruit sando carried with it across the sea, without meaning to, was a quiet reminder that the most pleasing things often resist easy classification, and that this resistance is not a flaw but a kind of freedom, a refusal to be only one thing when two things are both true. Somewhere tonight, someone is eating something sweet between two pieces of bread, and whether it is a sandwich or a dessert has not crossed their mind. The night holds this gently, the 40 sandwiches disappearing from a London shelf in the early morning light, the oversized Jaffa cake patient on its courtroom table in 1991, the convenience store in Japan with its humming refrigerator case and its wrapped offerings, and the soft city moving outside the fogged glass doors. These are small things, and small things carry their own kind of completeness, the kind that asks only a few quiet minutes and gives back something difficult to name but easy to feel, like warmth after a long evening, like the weight of a blanket settling in the dark. And so the fruit sando rests here, between its two categories, between its two countries, between the question of what it is and the simpler fact of what it tastes like, and both of those things are true, and neither needs to win. And that, perhaps, is where this story rests for tonight. And so, we have reached the end of tonight's stories. The last voice has faded, the last door has quietly closed. We hope these small windows into other lives, their struggles, their quiet courage, their moments of unexpected grace, have given your mind somewhere gentle to rest tonight. Thank you for spending these hours with us. Whether you found your way here by chance or by habit, we are glad you stayed. Sleep is a kind of trust, and we do not take it lightly that you chose to let these stories carry you. If you are still awake now, that is all right too. Let your breath slow. Let the room hold you. You have nothing left to do tonight. Nowhere to be. The morning will come in its own time, softly, and find you rested. And if you find your way back here on another night, more stories will be waiting, quiet voices, distant rooms, lives that fold gently into the dark alongside yours. Until then, rest well. Dream something kind. And wake, when the time comes, to a morning that feels a little more like grace. Good night.